I probably shouldn't admit this, but I used to think I was smarter than most people. Not in an obnoxious way, I hope, but I had this quiet confidence that I could navigate situations others couldn't, work things out, stay a step ahead. Looking back now, that belief feels almost funny. Almost. This happened about 18 months ago, when I was living in Bristol and working as a copywriter for a marketing agency. Decent job, decent flat, decent life. Nothing extraordinary, but I was content enough. My evenings usually involved cooking something simple, maybe watching a series, occasionally meeting friends at the pub. Pretty standard existence for someone in their late 20s. I'd heard about the dark web the same way everyone has, through articles and documentaries that make it sound like this lawless digital wasteland full of hitmen and drugs and worse. But I'd also read enough to know that a lot of it was exaggerated, that plenty of it was mundane, even boring. Activists and journalists used it. People in countries with restricted internet access. It wasn't all horror stories. So when a colleague mentioned it one afternoon, talking about how you could find leaked databases and deleted information, I was curious. Not about anything illegal, mind you. I just wanted to see what was actually there, what all the fuss was about. I went home that evening and spent maybe half an hour getting set up. It was easier than I'd expected. A few simple steps, and I was browsing this completely different version of the internet. The first thing I noticed was how slow everything was. Pages took ages to load. Links were broken constantly. Most sites looked like they'd been designed sometime around the year 2000 and never updated. I spent an hour or so clicking around, finding mostly disappointment. Some marketplaces that looked obviously dodgy. A few forums discussing things I had no interest in. Nothing particularly shocking or exciting. Then I found a site called Request Exchange. It was buried in one of those directory listings, described simply as Community Service Platform. When I opened it, the page was plain. White background, black text, minimal formatting. At the top was a simple explanation. This was a place where people could post requests for information or tasks they needed completed, and others could fulfill those requests. Like a bizarre anonymous version of a freelancing site. The requests were strange. Someone wanted copies of building blueprints for an office complex in Leeds. Another person needed photographs of a specific car park in Edinburgh at different times of day. Someone else wanted detailed information about a particular person's daily routine, including where they worked and what time they left home. That one made me uncomfortable, obviously, but I kept scrolling. Most requests were vague enough that you couldn't tell if they were legitimate or sinister. Need access to email account. Could be someone trying to recover their own lost account, or someone planning something awful. Require footage from specific location. Could be a researcher or a stalker. The anonymity made everything feel slippery and uncertain. What caught my attention was how many requests were marked as completed. Each one had a status indicator, and dozens showed as fulfilled. Underneath those, there were sometimes comments. Anonymous users saying things like, "Received, thanks," or "Perfect," exactly what I needed. It was active. People were actually using this. At the bottom of the page was a link, "Submit your request." I clicked it, not really thinking, just curious about what the process looked like. A form appeared, simple and straightforward. A text box for describing what you wanted. A field for providing an anonymous email address where responses could be sent. Optional fields for offering payment, though I noticed many requests left this blank. And a disclaimer at the bottom stating that the site took no responsibility for any requests or responses, that everything was entirely at the user's own risk. I sat there for a while, cursor blinking in the empty text box, wondering what I'd even ask for if I was going to submit something. I didn't need anything. I wasn't trying to track anyone down or obtain private information. I was just looking. Then, almost as a joke, I typed something. I can't even remember exactly what made me think of it, but I wrote, "Need to know what happened in flat 3B, Ashford House, Cheltenham, between 2008 and 2010. That was my childhood address, the flat where I'd lived with my parents until I was about 11, before we'd moved to Reading. I hadn't thought about that place in years. Nothing particularly interesting had happened there, as far as I knew. We'd just been an ordinary family, living an ordinary life in an ordinary flat. But I suppose some part of me was curious if there was anything to find. Any random bit of forgotten history or trivial information that might be lurking in some database somewhere. I almost deleted it. It felt stupid. But then I thought, why not? It's anonymous. Nothing would come of it. No one would bother responding to something so random and pointless. I created a temporary email address, the kind that self-destructs after a few hours, and pasted it into the form. Then I submitted the request. I closed the browser and didn't think about it again for a couple of days. Then I remembered to check the temporary email account, mostly just to see if it was still active. When I logged in, there were 3 messages waiting. The first was spam, something about cryptocurrency that I deleted immediately. The second was from the request exchange site itself, just a confirmation that my request had been posted. The third email had no subject line. The sender's address was just a string of random characters. I opened it. The message was brief. Information attached. Let me know if you need more. There was a zip file attached, about 30 megabytes. I downloaded it, scanned it for viruses, and extracted the contents. Inside were dozens of documents, PDFs mostly, scanned images of what looked like official paperwork. The first document I opened was a tenancy agreement for flat 3B, Ashford House, Cheltenham, dated 2006. The names on it weren't my parents' names. It was from before we'd lived there. I recognized the landlord's name though, the same property company that had managed the building when we were there. I opened another document, a police report, dated March 2009. I lived there in March 2009. I would have been about 9 years old. The report described a noise complaint, neighbors reporting shouting and sounds of a disturbance coming from flat 3B. Officers attended, spoke to the residents who assured them everything was fine. No further action taken. I didn't remember that. I didn't remember any police coming to our flat, but I would have been a child. Maybe I'd been asleep. Maybe my parents had kept it from me. The next document was another police report, July 2009, same flat. This time, neighbors reported hearing what sounded like someone crying for help. Officers attended again. Again, residents said everything was fine. The report noted that the officers had no grounds to enter without permission and that the residents had refused entry. I felt cold. That didn't make sense. We'd lived there. My mum, my dad, me. We were a normal family. We didn't have police turning up at the door. We didn't have neighbors complaining. I'd have remembered that, wouldn't I? I kept opening documents. More police reports, scattered across 2008 and 2009. More noise complaints. One report mentioned officers seeing a woman at the door who appeared distressed but claimed everything was fine. Another mentioned a man who seemed agitated and defensive. Descriptions that could have fit my parents, but the details were vague enough that I couldn't be certain. Then I found something else, a social services document, dated October 2009. It described a welfare check conducted at the property following multiple complaints from neighbors. The report stated that a child was observed in the flat and appeared withdrawn and underweight. The social worker had attempted to speak to the child, but had been prevented by the parents. A follow-up visit had been scheduled. I was the child. I had to be. I was the only child living in that flat. But I didn't remember any of this. I didn't remember being withdrawn or underweight. I didn't remember social workers visiting. I remembered my childhood as being mostly happy, normal, nothing unusual. There were more documents, follow-up reports from social services, notes about attempted visits where no one answered the door, concerns raised but insufficient evidence to take further action. Everything trailing off in early 2010, around the time we moved away. The last document in the folder was different. It was a scan of a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed, and the ink faded in places. It was addressed to the authorities, but didn't seem to have been sent anywhere. Just written and kept. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. The letter described living in flat 3B during 2009. It talked about hearing things through the walls, a child crying at odd hours, long periods of silence, sounds like furniture being moved in the middle of the night. The writer said they'd called the police several times, but nothing had ever been done. They said they'd moved out of the building in 2010 because they couldn't stand listening anymore. They said they still thought about that flat sometimes, about what might have been happening there, about whether they should have done more. I read the letter 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in my living room, staring at nothing, trying to process what I'd just seen. I called my mum the next day. We spoke maybe once a week, usually about nothing important. She still lived in Reading with my dad. I'd seen them a few months earlier at Christmas. Everything had been normal, fine. I kept the conversation light, asked how they were doing, mentioned work. Then, casually, I brought up Cheltenham, said I'd been thinking about the old flat, asked if she remembered much about living there. She said, not really. It had been a long time ago, just another rental property. We'd moved around a lot when I was younger because of my dad's work. Why was I asking? I said I'd just been reminiscing, nothing important. She changed the subject, started telling me about my cousin's new baby, and I let the conversation drift away from Cheltenham entirely. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I didn't know how to. What would I even say? I found documents online suggesting something was wrong when we lived in Cheltenham, that social services had been involved, that neighbors thought something bad was happening. She'd either have an explanation that would make me feel stupid for worrying, or she'd be upset that I was digging into the past, or worse, she'd confirm that something awful had happened and I'd somehow blocked it out entirely. None of those options felt manageable. I went back to the request exchange site. My original request was still there, now marked as completed. Underneath it, the anonymous responder had left a comment. Let me know if you need more details. I created a new temporary email address and sent a message to the account that had replied to me. I asked where they'd found the information, how they'd accessed police reports and social services documents, whether everything they'd sent was real. The response came within a few hours. Everything is real, sourced from various databases and physical archives. Can provide verification if needed. Do you want more? I didn't respond. I shut my laptop and tried to pretend I'd never seen any of it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Those documents felt true. The dates lined up. The address was correct. The details were too specific to be fabricated. But they also contradicted everything I remembered about my childhood. My parents had been normal, maybe a bit strict, but not abusive, not neglectful. We'd been happy. hadn't we? I started trying to remember specifics. What had our flat in Cheltenham actually looked like? I could picture my bedroom, small with a window that overlooked the car park. I remembered the kitchen, narrow and always a bit dark. The living room with the old sofa that had a tear in one cushion. But when I tried to remember actual events, actual moments, everything became hazy. Dinners, surely we'd had dinners together. Days out, we must have gone places. But I couldn't pin down specific memories. Just vague impressions. Maybe that was normal. Maybe everyone's childhood memories are fragmented and unreliable. I was 9 years old, maybe 10. Of course I wouldn't remember everything clearly. A week passed. I tried to focus on work, on my normal life, but the documents kept circling through my mind. That letter especially. The neighbor who'd written about hearing a child crying, about long silences, about furniture being moved in the night. I went back to the site. The anonymous responder's comment was still there, offering more details. I sent another message. I asked what else they had, what else they could find about that flat, that time period, my family. The response came quickly. Can provide additional materials. Will take a few days to compile. Confirm you want to proceed. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the laptop and walked away. But I didn't. I replied, yes. 3 days later, another email arrived. Another zip file, this one larger. Over 100 megabytes. I downloaded it and extracted the contents. The folder was organized chronologically. It started in 2007, a year before my memories of living there began. There were photographs, scanned prints, not digital images. They showed the interior of Flat 3B, but not the way I remembered it. The walls were different colors. The furniture was different. These were from before we moved in. Then documents from 2008, more tenancy records, utility bills in my parents' names, council tax statements, everything normal and mundane and proving that yes, we had lived there, exactly when I thought we had. Then something else, medical records, mine, from a GP surgery in Cheltenham, appointments logged throughout 2008 and 2009. The notes were brief and clinical, but there were a lot of them. More than I'd expect for a healthy child. References to injuries, a fractured wrist in June 2008, bruising in August 2008, a suspected concussion in January 2009. Each time, the note said the parents had provided explanations. Falls, accidents, normal childhood mishaps. I don't remember any of that. I don't remember breaking my wrist. I don't remember any concussion. More documents. School records from the primary school I'd attended in Cheltenham. Attendance was patchy, lots of absences. Notes about my behavior, described as quiet and withdrawn. One teacher's note mentioned concerns about possible neglect, but stated there wasn't enough evidence to report formally. Then photographs, not scans this time. Digital images taken with a phone or camera. They showed the exterior of Ashford House at different times, day and night, different seasons, cars in the car park, windows of the building. Some of the photos had timestamps, taken in 2010, 2011, years after we'd moved away. Then photographs of other buildings, a house in Reading. I recognized it immediately. My parents' current house, the one they'd bought after we left Cheltenham. Photos of the front door, the driveway, the garden. Recent photos, judging by the car in the driveway. My dad's car. Same model, same color, same registration plate visible in one of the shots. My hands were shaking. I closed the laptop and pushed it away from me. Someone had been watching my parents' house recently. and they'd sent me the proof. I sent another email to the anonymous account. I asked who they were, why they were sending me this, what they wanted. The response came an hour later. You asked for information. I provided it. Do you want more? I wrote back, why do you have photos of my parents' house? Why are you watching them? The response, I'm not watching anyone. These were requested by someone else. I'm just the one who compiled the information. I felt sick. Someone else had requested information about my parents, about their house, about them. And this person, whoever they were, had gathered it and sent it along with everything else. I asked who had requested it. I didn't expect an answer. The response came anyway. Can't share that. But they asked for it recently, within the last few months. Wanted current information about the same family, same address history, same people. Someone had been looking into my family, into me, into the flat in Cheltenham, and what had happened there, and where we were now. I asked what else they'd shared, what else this other person had received. The response, everything I sent you, plus more. They wanted ongoing monitoring, photos, updates. I declined that request. Too much work. I asked if they knew who the other person was, anything about them. The response, no, that's how this works. Everything is anonymous. But if you want my opinion, they already knew your family. They weren't starting from scratch. They had specifics, details. They were confirming information, not discovering it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to work out who would be looking into my family. Someone from Cheltenham, an old neighbour, someone from social services who'd never forgotten about those welfare checks, or someone else entirely, someone I'd never considered. I called my mum again the next morning. I couldn't help myself. I asked if anything strange had been happening, anyone hanging around the house, any odd phone calls or visitors. She said no, everything was fine. Why was I asking these weird questions? I said I'd just been worried about her, scams and things like that. Older people getting targeted. She laughed and said she wasn't that old. And anyway, everything was fine. I wanted to believe her. I went back to the request exchange site one last time. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Some explanation maybe. Some way to make sense of it all. I scrolled through the list of completed requests, looking for anything that might be related to my family. Most were too vague to tell. But then I saw one, marked as completed about 4 months earlier. The request was simple. Need full background on family, previous addresses, Cheltenham and Reading, current status and location. That could have been about anyone, but the timing matched. 4 months ago, around when those photos of my parents' house were taken. I looked at my own request, the one I'd submitted weeks earlier. Right below it was another request, posted the day after mine. It said, need updated information on same family, confirm current address and situation. Someone had seen my request, seen me asking about flat 3B in Cheltenham, and they'd submitted their own request immediately after, asking for current information about my family. I'd led them right to us. I shut down my laptop and haven't been back to that site since. I don't know what to do with the information I have. Those documents about my childhood might be real, or they might be elaborate fabrications designed to unsettle me. The photos of my parents' house might mean someone's watching them, or they might mean nothing at all. But someone out there knows who we are. They know where my parents live. They knew enough about our history to request specific information, and they received it from me because I was curious, because I thought I was clever enough to navigate something I didn't understand. My parents are fine, as far as I know. I call them more often now. Sometimes I drive up to Reading on weekends just to check on them. They think I'm being unusually attentive. They don't ask why. I haven't told them about any of this. Maybe I should. Maybe they'd have explanations for those documents from Cheltenham. Maybe they'd remember the police visits and the social workers and have perfectly reasonable explanations for all of it. Maybe I'd feel stupid for worrying. Or maybe they'd confirm that something terrible happened during those years, something they've spent decades trying to forget, and now I've dragged it all back into the light by being careless on a website I should never have visited in the first place. I don't know which possibility frightens me more. What I do know is that information never disappears. Once it's out there, once it's been compiled and shared and passed between anonymous accounts on sites you can't trace, you lose control of it completely. And sometimes the act of looking for answers creates new questions, new problems, new threats. I was wrong about being smarter than most people. I was just lucky for a long time. That luck ran out the moment I submitted that request. And now all I can do is wait and see if whoever wanted information about my family decides they need something more than just photos and documents. I check my parents' house on Google Maps sometimes, Street View, making sure it looks the same as the last time I visited, making sure nothing's changed. It's become a compulsion. Every few days, I'll pull up the image, compare it to my memory, and try to convince myself that everything's fine. But I know that somewhere out there, someone else is looking at the same house, someone with their own reasons, their own plans, and I'm the one who helped them find it. Do you have one of those repair people you trust? A plumber or electrician whose number you keep saved because they've done good work before and you know they'll turn up when they say they will? I had someone like that. A handyman called Steve who'd fixed various things around my house over the past few years. A leaking tap, some dodgy wiring, a bathroom fan that had stopped working. Reliable, reasonably priced, the sort of person you're grateful to have found in a world where tradespeople are often impossible to pin down. I gave him a key to my house once, just for convenience, whilst he worked on a job when I couldn't be there. That single decision is why I now know my kitchen looks different at 3 a.m. than it does during the day. Why I've seen footage of my bedroom that I definitely didn't record, and why my home address appears on a website that charges people for live access to spaces they have no right to see. I'm a physiotherapist working at a clinic in Sheffield. Been there for about 7 years. I live in a semi-detached house in one of the suburbs, the kind of area where people know their neighbours vaguely, but mostly keep to themselves. It's a decent house, nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I've worked hard to afford it. I live alone, which I've always preferred. The freedom to keep my own schedule, the peace and quiet after dealing with patients all day. Steve first did some work for me about 3 years ago. I'd found him through a recommendation from a colleague whose bathroom he'd renovated. He'd come round to fix a persistent leak under my kitchen sink that I'd been ignoring for too long. He was punctual, polite, did the job efficiently, and charged a fair price. Over the following years, I called him back for various other bits and pieces, replacing light fixtures, fixing a loose banister, installing some shelving in the spare room. Last autumn, I needed some electrical work done in the hallway. A ceiling light had started flickering worryingly, and I wanted it sorted properly rather than just replacing the bulb and hoping for the best. Steve came round to assess the job and said it would take most of an afternoon. The problem was I had several patient appointments scheduled that day and couldn't take time off. Steve suggested I could leave him a key, and he let himself in and out. locking up properly when he finished. He'd done this for other clients before, he said, and it made things easier than trying to coordinate schedules. I hesitated slightly. It's never comfortable giving someone access to your home when you're not there. But I'd known Steve for years at this point, and he'd never given me any reason to doubt his professionalism. I agreed, and left a spare key under the back doormat with instructions about which light was the problem. The work was done exactly as promised. When I got home that evening, the light was fixed, the key was back under the mat, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Steve sent a text to confirm he'd finished, and I transferred the payment that evening. Simple, professional, exactly the kind of smooth transaction that makes you feel you've made the right choice in tradespeople. About 2 weeks later, I started noticing things that seemed slightly off. Nothing major, just small details that didn't quite match how I remembered leaving them. A kitchen cupboard door that I was sure I'd closed was standing open. The living room curtains were pulled slightly wider apart than I usually positioned them. A throw cushion on the sofa had moved from one end to the other. I put it down to tiredness and distraction. I'd been working long hours covering for a colleague on sick leave, and it's easy to forget small actions when your mind is occupied with other things. Everyone has moments where they can't quite remember whether they've done something or just intended to. But the occurrences continued. More cupboards left open. Lights turned on in rooms I was certain I'd left dark. My bedroom door standing ajar when I always closed it fully. The bathroom bin moved from its usual spot by the sink to underneath the window. Each incident was minor enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Then I noticed something more concrete. I have a small jewelry box on my bedroom dresser, just costume pieces mostly, nothing valuable. The box has a particular way I arrange it. Necklaces on one side, earrings on the other, a few rings in a little compartment at the back. One morning, I found everything mixed together, the necklaces tangled with the earrings, the rings scattered throughout. I hadn't touched that box in over a week. That's when I started to suspect someone had been entering my house. Not to steal, nothing was missing as far as I could tell, but simply to be there, to move through the space and disturb things in small ways that made their presence known. It felt deliberate, like someone wanted me to realize my home wasn't as private as I believed. I checked all the doors and windows, looking for signs of forced entry. Everything was secure and undamaged. The locks showed no evidence of tampering. There was no obvious explanation for how someone could be getting in, unless they had a key. And the only person outside my immediate family who'd ever had access to my key was Steve. I tried to dismiss the thought. Steve was a professional tradesman with plenty of work. No reason to risk his reputation and livelihood by sneaking into clients' homes. But the timing fit. The disturbances had started after he'd used my key to do that electrical work, and he'd had ample opportunity to copy the key before returning it. I changed my locks anyway, just to be safe. It cost more than I'd hoped, but I needed to feel secure in my own home. For about a week afterwards, everything seemed normal. No more mysterious disturbances, no more items moved or lights left on. I felt relieved, convinced that changing the locks had solved whatever problem had existed, even if I never fully understood what it had been. Then one morning, I found a mug in my kitchen sink that I didn't recognize. Not one of mine, just a plain white mug, but definitely not from my cupboards. It was sitting in the sink, like someone had used it for tea or coffee and left it there to wash later. The casual domesticity of it made my skin crawl. Someone had been in my house, made themselves a drink, used a mug they'd brought with them, and left it behind deliberately. I called the police immediately. They came and took the mug for fingerprints, took a statement about the incidents I'd been experiencing, checked the house for any signs of how someone might be entering. They found nothing conclusive. The mug had been wiped clean. There were no marks on doors or windows, no sign of how access was being gained. The officer who responded suggested I install cameras inside the house, not just external security, but something that would capture anyone moving around inside. I did that the same day, setting up several small cameras in the hallway, kitchen, and living room, all connected to my phone so I'd receive alerts if they detected movement while I was out. For 3 days, the cameras showed nothing unusual. Just me leaving in the morning and returning in the evening, the house empty and undisturbed in between. I started to think maybe the mug had been enough. Maybe whoever was doing this had realized they'd been too obvious and had stopped. Then on the 4th day, I received a movement alert around 2 in the afternoon. I was with a patient at the time and couldn't check immediately. But as soon as I had a break, I pulled up the camera feed on my phone. The footage showed a figure moving through my house, walking casually from room to room as though they had every right to be there. It was Steve. I recognized him immediately despite the cap he was wearing. He moved through my kitchen, opened cupboards and peered inside, stood looking out of the living room window for a few minutes. He went upstairs beyond the range of my cameras and stayed there for about 20 minutes before coming back down and leaving through the front door. The whole visit lasted around 40 minutes. I felt sick watching it. This was someone I'd trusted, someone I'd paid for honest work, someone I'd given access to my home because I thought he was reliable and professional. And he'd been entering my house regularly, walking through my private spaces, doing God knows what whilst I was at work, and completely unaware. I saved the footage and took it straight to the police station when I finished work that evening. This time, they had clear evidence of a crime, an identifiable suspect. They visited Steve that evening and arrested him. When they searched his van, they found keys to around 30 different properties, all carefully labeled with addresses. My key was among them, freshly cut to match my new locks. He'd somehow obtained details of my new lock type and had a key made before I'd even realized the locks had been changed. But what they found at his house was worse. He had hard drives containing thousands of hours of video footage from inside people's homes. Not just footage of him walking through empty houses, but recordings from cameras he'd installed secretly during legitimate repair visits. Tiny cameras hidden in smoke detectors, air vents, light fixtures. Devices he'd placed while supposedly fixing problems, whilst homeowners trusted him to work unsupervised in their properties. The footage went back years, hundreds of homes across Sheffield and surrounding areas, all of them belonging to people who'd hired him for basic maintenance work and unknowingly given him opportunities to install surveillance equipment. The videos showed everything. People going about their daily lives, private moments they thought were completely unwitnessed, intimate details of how they lived when they believed they were alone. During questioning, Steve admitted he'd been selling access to these camera feeds on the dark web. He'd created accounts for each property, organized by location and type of residence, and charged subscription fees for people to watch live feeds from inside strangers' homes. Some buyers wanted to watch specific types of households. Others just wanted the voyeuristic thrill of observing people who had no idea they were being watched. A detective showed me the website where my home had been listed. It was organized like a streaming service, with thumbnail previews of different properties and descriptions of what viewers could expect to see. My house was categorized under single-occupant female residences, with notes about my work schedule and typical routine. The listing boasted about multiple camera angles and high video quality. The subscription data showed my feed had been purchased by around 40 different people over the months since Steve had installed the cameras. 40 strangers had been watching me move around my own home, had observed my private routines, had seen everything I did whilst thinking I was completely alone and unobserved. The thought of it made me feel violated in a way that was difficult to articulate. The detective explained that the cameras Steve had installed were sophisticated enough to be nearly impossible to find without knowing exactly what to look for. They were powered by the home's electrical system, so they didn't require battery changes. They used the home's internet connection to stream footage, but did so in ways that wouldn't show up obviously en route to traffic. Unless you were specifically looking for hidden surveillance equipment with professional detection tools, you'd never know they were there. It took a team of specialists most of a day to find and remove all the cameras from my house. There were 5 in total, 1 in a hallway smoke detector, 1 in a kitchen air vent, 1 in the living room lamp fixture, 1 in the bathroom extractor fan, and 1 in my bedroom ceiling light. 5 devices that had been watching me for months, recording everything, streaming it to paying subscribers who viewed my private life as entertainment. Steve was prosecuted and received a prison sentence, though it seemed inadequate given the scale of what he'd done and the number of people he'd violated. The investigation identified over 80 homes where he'd installed surveillance equipment, though they suspected there were more they never found. Many of his victims never knew what had happened because he'd removed the cameras himself after subscription interest waned or before homeowners planned renovations that might uncover them. The website where the footage was sold was shut down, but police confirmed the videos had been downloaded by subscribers before they could seize the servers. Months of footage from my home existed in private collections, potentially being reshared through other platforms or simply kept for personal viewing. There was no way to recover or delete all of it. It was out there permanently, beyond any control or remedy. I sold that house within 4 months of discovering the cameras. I couldn't live somewhere that had been so thoroughly surveilled, where strangers had watched me sleep and shower and exist in moments I'd believed were completely private. Every room felt contaminated by the knowledge of what had happened there, what had been recorded and sold and viewed by people whose names I'd never know. My new house was built recently enough that it doesn't need much maintenance, which is fortunate because I'll never hire another tradesperson to work unsupervised in my home. I've learned to do basic repairs myself, and for anything beyond my capabilities, I take time off work to be present whilst the work is done. I visually inspect every smoke detector, every vent, every light fixture regularly, checking for anything that seems out of place. But I know the footage still exists somewhere. Months of my life recorded without my knowledge or consent, available to people who paid for the privilege of watching a stranger in her own home. Every private moment I had during that period is potentially being viewed by someone right now, shared in spaces I'll never access, discussed by people I'll never identify. What disturbs me most is thinking about how many other people are living in homes with hidden cameras they don't know about. How many tradespeople are operating similar schemes right now, installing surveillance equipment during legitimate repair visits, selling access to private lives through dark web marketplaces. Steve was caught because I noticed he'd entered my house and installed obvious security cameras. But if I'd never noticed the initial intrusions, if I'd never installed those cameras, he'd still be operating. The surveillance would have continued indefinitely, and I'd never have known my home wasn't actually private. I gave a tradesperson a key once, a simple convenience to avoid scheduling conflicts done with someone I trusted based on years of apparently professional service. That decision led to months of secret surveillance. my private life sold to strangers as entertainment. Permanent footage existing in collections I'll never locate or control. That's what I think about now when I see repair vans in residential areas. Not whether the tradesperson is qualified or professional, but whether they're installing more than they're fixing. Whether they're creating opportunities for surveillance whilst homeowners trust them to work alone. Whether the homes they visited are being watched right now by paying subscribers who view private lives as commodities worth purchasing access to. I've always been the responsible type. Growing up, I was the kid who reminded teachers about homework and never forgot to lock the front door. My mum used to say I was born middle-aged, which wasn't exactly a compliment, but wasn't entirely wrong either. That reliability served me well when I moved to Manchester for university. While my course mates were getting bladdered every night and sleeping through lectures, I kept my head down, studied hard, and managed my money carefully. By my second year, I built up a decent reputation as someone who could be trusted with responsibilities that other students would probably mess up. That's how I ended up house-sitting for Professor Williams. She taught European history and lived in one of those Victorian terraces in Didsbury that academics always seem to end up in. The place was filled with books and quirky furniture, looking like it had been furnished entirely from charity shops, but somehow working perfectly together. She'd been recommended for a visiting fellowship at Oxford and needed someone reliable to look after her house for 6 months. The arrangement was brilliant for me. Free accommodation in a much nicer area than I could normally afford, plus a small monthly payment for handling basic maintenance and keeping the place secure. All I had to do was water her plants, deal with any post, and make sure the house didn't get broken into while she was away. Professor Williams was thorough about explaining everything before she left, which plants needed watering when, how to work the ancient central heating system, where the stopcock was in case of emergencies. She showed me around every room, pointing out anything that might need attention and making sure I understood how everything worked. The house was larger than it looked from outside, with rooms that seemed to have been added on over the years without much planning. There was a study lined with books from floor to ceiling, a conservatory full of plants that she was particularly worried about, and a cellar that she used for storage, but told me I probably wouldn't need to access. She also had a small office upstairs where she did her research, with a computer and filing cabinets full of what looked like academic papers and correspondence. She asked me not to disturb anything in there, which was fine by me. I had no interest in medieval trade routes or whatever it was she specialized in. The first few weeks went smoothly. I settled into a routine of checking the plants every couple of days, bringing in any post, and generally making sure everything was ticking over normally. The house was comfortable and quiet, much better for studying than my previous shared accommodation, where someone was always playing music or having people round. Professor Williams had left me her contact details and asked me to send weekly updates about how everything was going. Just brief emails letting her know that the house was fine and there were no problems. She was clearly quite anxious about leaving her home for such a long period, which I could understand given how much stuff she had accumulated over the years. But after about a month, I started receiving emails from her that seemed odd. She began asking very specific questions about things happening around the house, whether I'd noticed anyone lurking in the street outside, if any post had arrived that wasn't addressed to her, whether I'd heard any unusual noises during the night. The sort of questions that suggested she was worried about something more serious than just general burglary concerns. When I assured her that everything was completely normal and quiet, she seemed relieved but also somehow surprised, as if she'd been expecting something to happen and was puzzled that it hadn't occurred yet. She also started giving me additional instructions about security, making sure all windows were locked every night, not answering the door to anyone I didn't recognize, being careful about what information I shared if neighbors asked questions about her absence. Again, sensible precautions, but the level of concern seemed disproportionate to the actual risks. I began paying more attention to the house and neighborhood, wondering if there was something I'd missed that was making Professor Williams so anxious. But Didsbury was exactly the sort of middle-class area where the biggest crime problem was probably bicycle theft. The neighbors were friendly but not intrusive. The street was well lit and regularly patrolled, and I'd never felt unsafe walking around at any time of day or night. The house itself also seemed perfectly secure. Good locks on all the doors and windows, a modern alarm system, even security lights that came on automatically if anyone approached the property after dark. Whatever Professor Williams was worried about, she'd clearly taken reasonable precautions to protect against it. That's when I started exploring the house more thoroughly. I'd been respectful of her privacy during the first month, staying in the main living areas and only going into other rooms when necessary for maintenance. But her increasingly worried emails made me curious about whether there was something about the property that she hadn't mentioned during her initial tour. The study and conservatory were exactly as she'd shown me. Nothing unusual or concerning. Her bedroom and the guest room where I was staying were also completely normal. But when I started looking more carefully at the upstairs office, I noticed things that hadn't registered during my initial visit. The filing cabinets contained much more than just academic research. There were folders full of correspondence with solicitors, insurance companies, and what appeared to be private investigators. Legal documents related to property disputes, insurance claims for items that had apparently been stolen, even what looked like restraining orders taken out against individuals whose names I didn't recognize. Professor Williams had clearly been dealing with some serious problems that went well beyond normal academic concerns. The computer in her office was password protected, but she'd left it logged in with several browser windows open. Most were related to her research, but there were also tabs showing websites that specialized in personal security and surveillance detection. Forums where people discussed stalking, harassment, and methods for protecting yourself against individuals who posed ongoing threats. It was becoming clear that Professor Williams's anxiety about house security wasn't general paranoia. She was dealing with specific threats from people who had targeted her in the past and might try to access her property while she was away. I started reading through more of the documents in her filing cabinets, trying to understand what kind of situation I'd gotten myself involved with. What I found was a pattern of harassment and intimidation that had been going on for several years. Someone had been systematically targeting Professor Williams with various forms of harassment, items stolen from her garden, threatening letters posted through her door, even incidents of people attempting to break into her house while she was asleep. She'd reported everything to the police, but they'd been unable to identify the perpetrators or provide effective protection. The harassment seemed to be connected to her academic work, specifically research she'd been conducting into historical property ownership in the Manchester area. Some of her findings had apparently contradicted claims made by individuals who were involved in contemporary property disputes, and they'd responded by trying to intimidate her into retracting or modifying her conclusions. But the harassment had escalated beyond simple intimidation. Recent incidents included evidence that someone had been inside her house while she was away, moving items around and accessing her computer and files. Professional security assessments had confirmed that her property was being monitored by people with sophisticated surveillance equipment and detailed knowledge of her daily routine. The Oxford Fellowship hadn't been an academic opportunity. It had been an escape route. Professor Williams had accepted the position specifically to get away from Manchester until the harassment situation could be resolved. She'd hoped that a 6-month absence would convince her tormentors to move on to other targets. But leaving the house empty created new vulnerabilities. If the people harassing her were primarily interested in her research and files, an unoccupied property would provide the perfect opportunity for them to search through everything without interference. That's why she'd been so specific about security precautions and had asked for such detailed updates about any unusual activity. She wasn't just worried about burglary. She was expecting her harassers to use her absence as an opportunity to break in and steal or destroy her research materials. I realized I was essentially being used as a human security system, positioned in the house to deter break-in attempts and alert her if anyone tried to access her property. But I had no idea how dangerous these people might be or what they'd do if they discovered someone was living in the house they were planning to search. Professor Williams hadn't told me any of this because she'd known I probably wouldn't have agreed to house sit if I'd understood the real risks involved. Instead, she'd presented it as a straightforward arrangement that would benefit both of us while concealing the fact that I might be putting myself in serious danger. I considered confronting her about the deception, but I was also curious about what exactly she'd discovered that had made these people so determined to stop her research. The academic papers in her filing system were dense and technical, full of references to medieval property records and land ownership disputes that seemed unlikely to generate such extreme reactions. But when I started looking at her more recent work, I found research that was much more contemporary and potentially controversial. Professor Williams had been investigating connections between historical property ownership and modern property development in Manchester. Specifically, she'd been tracing how certain pieces of land had been acquired, developed, and transferred over several centuries, revealing patterns that suggested some contemporary property holdings might be based on fraudulent historical claims. Her research had identified several prominent Manchester property developers whose holdings appeared to be derived from land that had been acquired through forged documents, bribery, and other illegal methods during the 19th and early 20th centuries. If her findings were accurate, these developers' current property empires could be vulnerable to legal challenges that might cost them millions of pounds. That would certainly explain why someone might be willing to use harassment and intimidation to prevent her research from being published or used in legal proceedings. But it also meant that the people targeting her weren't just academic rivals or cranks with grievances about historical interpretations. They were potentially connected to serious criminal enterprises with substantial financial resources and a willingness to use violence to protect their interests. I was now living in a house that contained evidence of major property fraud, being targeted by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use illegal methods to suppress inconvenient research. Professor Williams's increasingly worried emails suddenly made much more sense. She wasn't just concerned about burglary. She was terrified that her research would be destroyed and that anyone protecting it might be seriously harmed in the process. I started taking much more serious security precautions, double-checking all locks every night, varying my daily routine to make it harder for anyone to predict when I'd be home, even researching escape routes from the house in case someone tried to break in while I was there. But I also began preparing to document and preserve Professor Williams's research in case something did happen to the original materials. If people were willing to commit serious crimes to suppress her findings, those findings were probably important enough to deserve protection. I started copying her files onto external storage devices, uploading important documents to secure cloud storage, even photographing particularly crucial papers so there would be multiple backups if the originals were destroyed. As I worked through her research more systematically, I began to understand why it posed such a serious threat to certain property developers. Her historical analysis didn't just identify questionable land acquisitions. It provided detailed documentation that could be used in court to challenge the legal ownership of some of Manchester's most valuable commercial and residential properties. Property worth hundreds of millions of pounds could potentially be redistributed if her research was accepted as evidence in legal proceedings. Entire business empires could collapse if the historical ownership claims they were based on were proven to be fraudulent. That level of financial exposure would certainly justify extreme measures to prevent the research from becoming public knowledge. But I also realized that simply copying and storing the research wasn't enough to protect it. If the people targeting Professor Williams discovered that backup copies existed, they'd probably escalate their efforts to suppress the information entirely. Anyone known to have access to her research would become a target for the same harassment and intimidation she'd experienced. And unlike an established academic with tenure and institutional support, a student house-sitter would be much more vulnerable to serious threats. I was sitting on evidence of major crimes committed by people with significant resources and demonstrated willingness to use illegal methods to protect their interests. Even if I tried to distance myself from the situation, I now knew too much to be completely safe from retaliation. The house-sitting arrangement that had seemed like such a good opportunity was actually a trap that had put me in serious danger without my knowledge or consent. That's when I started noticing signs that the house was being watched. Cars parked in the street for longer than normal, with occupants who seemed to be observing the property rather than visiting neighbors. People walking past more frequently than you'd expect for a quiet residential street, sometimes making multiple passes within short periods. Most concerning were indications that someone had been testing the house's security measures. Scratch marks around lock mechanisms that suggested attempted lockpicking, footprints in flower beds near windows, even what looked like small electronic devices attached to the property's exterior that might have been surveillance equipment. Professor Williams's harassers had apparently identified the house as a target and were conducting reconnaissance in preparation for a break-in attempt. I tried contacting her to report these developments, but her responses became increasingly evasive. She seemed reluctant to discuss specific security concerns and kept redirecting the conversation to routine house maintenance issues, as if she was worried that our email communications might be monitored by the same people who were targeting her research. When I pressed her for clearer guidance about what to do if I discovered evidence of attempted break-ins, she suggested that I might want to consider ending the house-sitting arrangement early and returning to normal student accommodation. But by this point, I was too invested in protecting her research to simply walk away. The historical property fraud she'd uncovered was exactly the sort of investigative journalism I hoped to pursue after graduation. Her work represented years of careful research that could expose serious crimes and help victims recover property that had been stolen from their families generations earlier. If I abandoned the house and her research was destroyed, important evidence of historical injustices would be lost forever. I decided to stay and take whatever precautions I could to protect both the property and the research materials. But I also started preparing for the possibility that the harassment might escalate to direct confrontation. That preparation turned out to be necessary sooner than I'd expected. I woke up 3 nights later to the sound of someone trying to force open the back door of the house. not attempting to pick the lock or disable the alarm system, just using brute force to break through the door and gain entry as quickly as possible. I had maybe 30 seconds before they got inside. I thought I was doing something good. That's what makes this whole situation so much worse. 6 months ago, I was just someone trying to make the internet a safer place. Now, I'm hiding in a Premier Inn somewhere in the Midlands, knowing that tomorrow night, thousands of people will tune in to watch me become the star of my own nightmare. It started when I applied for a job as a content moderator with a company called SafeNet Solutions. They advertise themselves as specialists in keeping harmful content off social media platforms. The work seemed meaningful, protecting children from inappropriate material, removing violent content, flagging harassment. The kind of job where you could feel like you were making a difference. I'd been unemployed for nearly 8 months after my last position was made redundant. Living in a shared house in Birmingham with people half my age. Watching my savings dwindle while sending off countless applications. When SafeNet offered me the position working from home with decent pay, I jumped at it without asking too many questions. The training was straightforward. They gave me access to their proprietary software that would queue up flagged content for review. Videos, images, live streams, all reported by automated systems or other users as potentially violating community guidelines. My job was to watch each piece of content and make a decision. Remove it, leave it up, or escalate it to a senior moderator. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Spam, harassment, people posting copyrighted material, the occasional violent video or inappropriate image involving children, which would get immediately escalated and removed. The work was emotionally draining. You see humanity at its worst when you're cleaning up after it. But it felt necessary. I worked remotely, reviewing content for 8 hours a day from my bedroom. The company provided the computer and software, along with strict guidelines about confidentiality. We weren't allowed to discuss our work with anyone outside the company, ostensibly to protect user privacy and prevent people from gaming the moderation system. About 2 months into the job, I started noticing patterns in some of the content that came through my queue. Videos that looked like they were filmed in similar locations, industrial settings with concrete walls and minimal furnishing. The content itself wasn't explicitly violating guidelines, but something about it felt off. Empty rooms with strange equipment, brief clips of preparations for something unclear. When I flagged these for escalation, asking for guidance on whether they violated guidelines, my supervisor would respond that they'd been reviewed and deemed acceptable. I was told to stop wasting time on borderline cases and focus on clear violations. The message was clear: approve these and move on. I tried to push back, suggesting that these videos might be connected to something harmful, but I was reminded that I was new and still in my probationary period. SafeNet had strict policies about overreach. Moderators who flagged too much borderline content would be let go for inefficiency. I needed the job, so I started approving the strange videos without comment. Then I began noticing something else. Some of the videos had embedded metadata that my software could read, but that wouldn't be visible to normal users. Location data, timestamps, user identifiers. I shouldn't have been able to see this information. It suggested my moderation software had deeper access to these platforms than a normal content reviewer would need. One evening, while reviewing a particularly odd video of an empty room with metal restraints visible in the background, I noticed that the metadata showed it was being live streamed to thousands of viewers simultaneously. This wasn't a recorded video that someone had uploaded. It was happening live. And yet, it was coming through my queue as if it were standard user-generated content awaiting moderation. That's when I realized I wasn't moderating content that had already been posted. I was pre-approving content that was about to be streamed live. My approval was what allowed these broadcasts to go public. I started paying closer attention to the content coming through my queue. Mixed in with normal reported posts were these live feeds from empty rooms, industrial settings, medical equipment, restraints, each one tagged with metadata showing thousands of waiting viewers, and each one requiring my approval before it could broadcast. I was essentially the gatekeeper for what I was beginning to suspect were preparation streams for red rooms. I tried to refuse approval for one of these feeds, marking it as violating guidelines for depicting implements that could be used for harm. Within an hour, I received a call from my supervisor. They reminded me that I was still in my probationary period and that my approval rates had been flagged as concerning. Too many rejections could result in immediate termination. But they also said something that chilled me. They mentioned that they had my address, my banking details, my emergency contacts, standard information for any employer, of course. But the way they referenced it felt like a veiled threat, like they wanted me to know how easy it would be to find me if I became a problem. I kept approving the feeds. What choice did I have? I needed the work, and I convinced myself that maybe I was wrong about what I was seeing. Maybe these were just art projects or horror film sets. Maybe the viewer counts were inflated. Maybe I was letting the stress of the job make me paranoid. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. A new type of content started coming through my queue. Not just empty rooms anymore, but rooms with people in them. People who looked unconscious or restrained. People who weren't acting. People who looked genuinely terrified when they were conscious. The metadata on these streams showed viewer counts in the tens of thousands. Chat functions that were active with comments I couldn't read, but that seemed to be taking requests or making suggestions. Payment information showing cryptocurrency transactions happening in real time. I couldn't approve them. I just couldn't. I started marking them all as violations, knowing it would flag my performance, but unable to live with myself if I didn't. For 3 days, I rejected every single one of these streams that came through my queue. On the 4th day, I received another package at my house. I hadn't ordered anything, and there was no delivery note. Inside was a tablet computer that automatically connected to a network when I turned it on. The screen showed a live feed of my own bedroom, taken from the camera on the work computer SafeNet had provided. I was looking at myself looking at the tablet. A message appeared on the tablet screen. You've been very thorough in your moderating work. Time for a performance review. Below it was a link to another stream, one showing an empty room with a metal table in the center. In the corner of the screen was a viewer counter, already showing thousands of people waiting, and a countdown timer set for 2 weeks from that day. I packed immediately and left Birmingham that night. I've been moving around England since then, staying in different hotels, buying train tickets with cash, avoiding CCTV when possible. But they keep finding me. Notes left in hotel rooms, messages sent to new phone numbers I've bought, photos of me taken in public places that get sent to whatever device I'm using. The most disturbing realization is that SafeNet Solutions isn't what I thought it was. It's not a company fighting against harmful content. It's a company facilitating it. They use legitimate content moderation as cover for something much darker. The majority of moderators probably are genuine, reviewing normal social media posts. But some of us, selected for particular reasons, were unknowingly gatekeeping for red room broadcasts. I think about how many streams I approved over those 4 months, how many people were harmed because I clicked approve on their preparatory footage, how many victims suffered because I was too concerned about keeping my job to ask harder questions about what I was really moderating. Last week, I tried going to the police in 3 different cities. The evidence I have is circumstantial. Screenshots, metadata, the tablet they sent me. But when I tried to describe the situation, it sounds like the paranoid delusions of someone who spent too much time looking at disturbing content. They take reports, but I can tell they think I'm either lying or having a mental health crisis. The countdown on the tablet now shows less than 2 days remaining. The viewer count has grown to tens of thousands. I've started receiving more specific messages about when and where I need to be. An address in Liverpool, a time, consequences for my family if I don't comply. And they've proven they know exactly where my sister lives, where my elderly parents shop, which route my niece takes to school. I've come to understand that the entire system is designed to implicate people who work for them. Every piece of content I approved created a digital trail connecting me to these broadcasts. Every rejection I made after discovering the truth could be used as evidence that I knew what was happening, but participated anyway. I'm not just a target now. I'm a liability who knows too much about their operation. The most terrifying part is realizing how vast this network must be. How many other content moderation companies might be fronts for similar operations? How many people think they're doing honest work cleaning up the internet when they're actually facilitating its darkest corners? I keep wondering if any of my colleagues at SafeNet knew what we were really doing. Were some of them complicit from the beginning? Were others like me, gradually drawn into something they didn't understand until it was too late? Or am I the only one who stumbled across this particular stream of content? The tablet just chimed with a new notification. The message is simple. Final preparations complete. Transport details being sent to your current location. I'm in a service station cafe somewhere between Leicester and Nottingham, trying to disappear into the crowd, but somehow they still know exactly where I am. I'm going to post this and then ditch the tablet somewhere. Maybe throw it in a bin, maybe leave it on the train. I don't know if it will make any difference. I don't know if anyone will believe this account, or if they'll dismiss it as the ramblings of someone who's lost touch with reality. But if you're working in content moderation, especially for smaller companies or remote positions, pay attention to what you're really approving. Ask questions about the metadata you can access. Notice patterns in the content. And if something feels wrong, trust that instinct even if it cost you the job. I thought I was making the internet safer. Instead, I was helping to make it infinitely more dangerous for the most vulnerable people. Every approval was another step toward this moment, when I become the content instead of the moderator. The countdown shows approximately 30 hours remaining. Thousands of people are waiting to watch what happens next. And somewhere in Liverpool, a room is being prepared for tomorrow night's broadcast. I should have asked more questions from the beginning. Should have trusted my instincts about those first strange videos. Should have realized that a job that seemed too good to be true probably was. But it's too late for should-haves now. The only thing left is to run and hope that somehow I can break free from a system I helped maintain, without ever understanding what it really was. The irony isn't lost on me. I spent months deciding what content was safe for public consumption. Now thousands of people are waiting to consume content featuring me. The moderator has become the moderated. I suppose the obvious way to start is simply to say that I shouldn't have kept that chest of drawers. When I first came across it, it looked harmless enough. Beach veneer lifting at the corners. One loose handle, part of a house clearance lot from a terraced place off Abbeydale Road. I wanted my Sheffield flat to feel finished without spending much, so I carried it up in 2 awkward bursts, rested it on the landing to catch my breath, and slid it against the bedroom wall by the window. The scrape it left on the skirting didn't matter. The room felt more like a room with somewhere to put socks. I found the phone by accident while lining the drawers with old wrapping paper. My nail snagged tape glued under the lip, revealing a thin, cheap handset, the sort you buy at a supermarket when you've cracked your screen. On the back, under scuffed plastic, was a printed sticker with a web address and a short code. I didn't throw it away. When charged, it opened to a tidy page. No logos I recognized, just flat colors, a small icon like an open box, and a form asking me to confirm an item had changed hands. Fields for a short code and postcode. A button saying continue. I'd read enough pieces with dark web in the headlines to recognize what I was looking at, even if I'd never used it. It felt like scanning a warranty card. I typed the code, tapped my postcode, and pressed continue. The reply came old-fashioned, on paper. An envelope under the end bench in the little park by the shops. My first name in tidy block capitals. Inside was enough for a modest food shop and folded instructions thanking me for registering. A small bonus would be paid if I confirmed the chest was positioned safely. To the left of the bed, level with the window but away from the radiator to avoid warping. I had already put it there. It asked for 2 photos from 2 angles. I sent them. A minute later, the page displayed a small green tick and nothing else. After that came jobs dressed as care. Take a photo with curtains drawn and the bedside lamp on. Another with curtains open and ceiling light off. Measure the gap from bed to door using your foot as a rough unit. Count steps from the front entrance to your landing. Film a slow pan across the window from street to sky. Each was paid the same way. Envelopes at places so ordinary they were almost funny. Behind the grit bin, under the 3rd slab at the tram stop, inside a station locker with a code. Enough cash to feel like something for nothing. Never so much it felt like a bribe. The first wrong thing was almost polite. After a courier dropped bulbs and a kettle I'd ordered, another knock came. No one stood outside when I checked the viewer, but a postcard lay on the mat. One side showed a printed map of my street, with a dot where my building sits, and a thin pencil arc traced from my window to the car park's far corner. The other side, in the same tidy hand from the envelopes, thanked me for confirming a line of sight. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even rude. It simply suggested that what I had done was useful to someone else. I started behaving like a person who keeps their head down. I took the drawers out and checked for surprises in the seams. Nothing. I pressed the backboard, flimsy fiberboard held by staples. I listened for clicks that weren't there. When small cards slid under the door with fresh codes, I entered them and did what was asked. Confirm whether the corridor smoke alarm uses a plastic key or hex screw. Photograph the intercom panel from arm's length. Record 30 seconds of street view from inside the window at dusk. Each task looked like a survey. Surveys don't bite. A woman in the block opposite pinned a note asking if anyone had seen a van outside at odd hours. People scribbled that they hadn't. I had seen plenty and said nothing. Not writing felt like the decision that kept everything ordinary. One night the drawer made a sound like a trapped insect under glass, tiny and quick. I pressed my ear to the top, just laminate easing as the heating clicked off. I said that to myself twice, and it became true enough to sleep on. In the morning, a card sat on the mat with a new code and time window. When I opened the page, It didn't show a form. It showed my room, a fisheye view from up on the wall to the left of the window, not wide enough to be the ceiling, not low enough to be bedside level. My unmade bed. The drawer exactly where the instructions had told me to put it. Yesterday's shirt on the chair. A small counter ticked in the corner. Text told me to leave the room and shut the door until the counter reached a certain point, then come back and stand in the doorway with the lamp on. No drama, no flashing warnings. I did what it said. When I stepped back into frame, the counter reset. The stream went black. The page turned into a form again, as if it had been bored and only pretending to be something else. I wanted to take the chest apart with a butter knife. I didn't. I put a towel on top like covering a birdcage and left the room. Later, a printed envelope arrived with a receipt from a locksmith 3 streets away. The date was from the previous week. The amount matched the cash I'd picked up the day before. I stood in the kitchen staring at the paper while something old and heavy settled behind my ribs. Paper can do that. It says you're not imagining things. I made a proper mess of it then. Unscrewed the backboard, laid the chest on its face, tapped every surface with my knuckle until it hurt. Cheap board sounds the same wherever you hit it. When I'd worked up sweat and nothing had changed, I put the back on and shoved the chest into the hallway like punishing it. I slept on the sofa with the bedroom door shut and bathroom light on. The next card asked me to be out during a loose hour in the early evening. There would be something on the kitchen table when I returned. I walked to the co-op and pushed a basket round in circles, buying milk slowly because going home faster felt like letting someone see me hurry. A padded envelope sat on the table when I returned. Inside was a small black cube and short cable. I saw where it had been placed before I plugged it in. A round patch of dust by the bookcase with a clean square in it. The stream now used a slightly different angle. Higher, nearer the corner. I could see the top of my head in the bottom edge when I leaned forward. The counter ticked up. I closed the browser and put the phone under the sofa cushion, then stood in the middle of the room doing nothing, because doing anything would have felt like admitting new rules existed. Payment changed to a station locker. A code at midday, inside a short stack of notes and a sheet saying everything was satisfactory and I should avoid changing the layout. Advice, not an order. I ignored it. Dragged the bed back where I wanted it, shoved the chest back into the hall, moved the lamp, swapped bulbs for cooler ones. The locksmith changed my cylinder and said the old one was fine. I slept badly, then normally. A person can't keep their shoulders to their ears forever. A month later, the crisp whisper of card on carpet woke me. On the mat, in a clear wallet, sat a laminated strip with my name and flat number and a line about a spare key, along with an old train ticket. The date made my stomach go light. It matched the afternoon I'd first registered the draw. I'd stood at the station then, checking departures, never thinking to wonder who else was looking. I typed the new code. The page split into 2 frames. One showed my hallway from near the coat rack, catching me holding the wallet. The other was a still of the bedroom from head height at the door. The bed sat where I'd pulled it back. The drawer was under the window again, as if it had gone there on its own. The towel I'd dropped 2 days earlier was half a plank left of where I'd left it. That was the part that made my mouth dry, not the camera, the towel. A short instruction asked me to leave the flat. I didn't. I sat on the stair looking at paint drips on the skirting, wiped before they dried. After what felt like a round number of minutes, I went back in. Nothing had moved. The towel was still wrong. I put my palm on the chest top and felt a trace of warmth where the towel had been the night before. The next cash pickup took me under the ring road where the river path echoes. Behind a loose cap on the third steel beam was a rolled envelope. Inside was the same amount and another printed map, this time of the stairwell and bin store. Arrows marked corners. A little circle was drawn at head height next to my door. It wasn't art, it was a list, turned sideways. The night everything tipped was ordinary. I found a plain cardboard box propped against my door, no label, no tape. It opened like it had been opened before. Inside was a black notebook and felt-tip pen. The first page set out neat rules for using the book, like a shared calendar. The next had a grid of days with short items. Take bins down, light off by 11. Curtains closed after dusk. Side window latched, front door on chain. My name was written inside the cover, steady as a school report. I took it to the bedroom to put on the wardrobe's top shelf. The shelf was lower than it had been. The little pegs were one notch down. A faint dust line marked where it had sat before. I knelt to look at the bottom panel. 2 shallow crescents pressed the carpet pile where toes would rest if someone had stood inside leaning forward. The smell in there wasn't mine. Clean, like fresh gloves. I lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling, white with lazy swirls and a faint stain near the light. In the corner above where the drawer had been, a hairline seam ran in the plaster. I'd never seen it. Now it was the only thing I could see. A place where a cable could be tucked, not high like a smoke alarm, but at the height of a person's eye if they stood and waited. I changed the lock again, borrowed my friend's small van, told him I'd gone off the drawer's look. We carried it down and left it by the recycling cages. I left the notebook on the kitchen table, turned the strange phone off, bought a ticket to the coast. I stayed above a pub where heating rattled and carpet bowed near the wardrobe. I slept with the lamp on and woke tasting dust. When I returned the next afternoon, my door showed no damage. Inside, the air had that cold, empty feel a room gets when no one's breathed in it for a day. The notebook had gone from the table. In its place lay a single sheet, cut from something bigger, like a delivery slip without branding. In neat handwriting, it recorded that a slot had been completed during the hour I was away. Below that, a short list noted that bed orientation, curtain position, drawer placement and latch use had been verified. A final note said the occupant had complied and future access was expected to be uncomplicated. No threats, no names, just a tone that said the work was straightforward. I didn't call anyone. I can pretend it was careful thinking about evidence and timing, but it was simpler. I couldn't face explaining how I'd registered a free drawer on a page that only loads a certain way, then collected envelopes under benches because instructions said there would be money there. I packed a bag, messaged a landlord about a short let I'd seen weeks earlier, and left. On the pavement, I looked back the way people look back at campsites, checking they haven't left rubbish behind. The windows looked like windows. The street looked like a street. It all looked clean. I moved 2 bus rides away with 2 cases and nothing that plugs in except my normal phone charger. I buy furniture new now, keep receipts in a shoebox, sleep with the bed in the room's middle because it makes thoughtless rearrangement harder. I still take bins down when the council asks. Routine makes noise in your head where silence might collect. I don't keep a chime on the hall socket. I don't take parcels for neighbors. I answer the buzzer with the chain on. None of this feels like safety. It feels like being less interesting. Sometimes I wake, not alarmed, just awake, and know without knowing that someone somewhere has ticked through another day I've had. Not photos, not a diary, a quiet grid in a black notebook with my tasks inside it. lines and crosses placed by a steady hand. It doesn't need storing anywhere clever. That wasn't the point. The point was that it was easy to keep. If you need a lesson, have this plain one. A flat can be read like a form. People will write in the boxes you don't fill. A lens fitted at head height sees a person who thinks they've chosen a safe place to put their head. A key can be cut when you're not looking, even if you changed the cylinder last week. A free drawer can arrive with a bill you don't see until later. The dark web doesn't have to look like masks or codes. Sometimes it looks like care instructions and tidy lists and cash where it says there will be cash. I still see that page in my head. The flat colors, the little counter in the corner, the neat tick when a job is done. I remember the first envelope under the bench and how clever I felt finding money that wasn't really hidden. I remember my breath fogging on the landing when I paused with the drawer. I think about the wardrobe shelf set one notch lower, the two crescents in carpet where toes pressed, the towel half a plank left of where I dropped it, the locksmith's receipt and how numbers on paper make a story feel like it has spine. I changed my number, changed how I throw away packaging, tearing labels, folding boxes small. I don't scan codes that arrive uninvited or touch house clearance furniture. If something comes with a bonus tucked in, I bin the bonus first. If a page offers a $5 for proving an easy fact, I leave it alone. Now and then, I pass the old street because routes cross whether you want them to or not. The bench is still there. The grit bin is still cracked. There's a new leaflet behind lobby glass about upcoming works and different trainers by a first floor door. Buildings keep going. People move in and out. Lights come on and off without meaning anything. I am the only person who stops at the corner and waits for nothing. Watching a square of faint yellow like it will say my name if I look long enough. I'll give you one last detail because it's the one I can hold without it slipping. The last morning I woke there, the air in the room felt the same as my skin. No draft, no temperature, just level. A new line had appeared in the dust on the wardrobe's top shelf where something had rested and been lifted. A thin, clean rectangle, set back an inch from the edge. When I stood on a chair and touched it, my finger made a smudge at one corner and nothing more. It wasn't proof of anything you could hand to someone else. It was a reminder, quiet as a breath, that the lightest thing can leave a mark if it sits still long enough. I shouldn't have kept the drawer. If you came here waiting for a shout or chase or door splintering, that isn't this. This is ordinary things arranged so a person becomes easy to move. The page made space for me to be helpful. The envelopes made it feel like I was included. The lens made the room smaller without changing its size. The notebook turned days into boxes someone else could tick. The rest is what you already know, even if you'd rather not say it out loud. Once you let something simple in, you don't decide where it stops. You only find out where it stopped when you've already left. It's funny how sometimes the most innocent decisions lead you down the darkest paths. Take my decision to become a night security guard at 34, for instance. I thought I was just taking a quiet job that would give me time to figure out what to do with the rest of my life after the redundancy from the council. Instead, I ended up discovering things about human nature that I wish I could forget. The job was at a small industrial estate in Coventry. Nothing glamorous, just a collection of warehouses and small manufacturing units that needed someone to walk around with a torch and make sure nobody was nicking anything. 12-hour shifts, 4 nights a week, decent pay for essentially doing nothing but staying awake and occasionally checking that doors were still locked. The site office had a proper security setup. Banks of monitors showing feeds from cameras dotted around the estate, a comfortable chair, and most importantly, a decent internet connection. Management had made it clear that as long as I did my hourly rounds and filed the incident reports, what I did with the rest of my time was my business. Perfect for someone trying to work out their next career move. Those first few weeks, I spent the quiet hours browsing job sites and updating my CV, but there's only so much career planning you can do at 3 in the morning before your brain starts craving something more stimulating. That's when I discovered online communities for night shift workers. Forums where security guards, hospital porters, warehouse staff, and various other nocturnal workers would gather to share stories and keep each other company during the long, empty hours. It was through one of these communities that I first heard about the deeper parts of the internet. Not the obvious stuff that makes headlines, drug markets, and identity theft, but the more obscure corners where people gathered to discuss things that wouldn't be tolerated on mainstream platforms. Privacy advocates, political dissidents, people who valued anonymity above all else. The appeal was obvious. After spending most of my adult life in local government, where every email was monitored and every website visit was logged, the idea of browsing the internet without leaving digital footprints felt liberating. Like taking off a suit of armor you'd been wearing so long you'd forgotten it was there. The technical side wasn't as complicated as I'd expected. There were guides, tutorials, entire communities dedicated to helping newcomers navigate safely. Within a few nights, I had access to a parallel internet that existed alongside the one most people knew about, invisible and unregulated. Most of it was surprisingly mundane. Forums discussing philosophy and politics, marketplaces selling legal but hard-to-find items, communities of people who simply preferred to communicate without corporate oversight. The criminal element was there certainly, but it felt more like a small part of a much larger ecosystem, rather than the dominant feature the media made it out to be. It was during my 3rd week of exploration that I stumbled across the discussion about live streaming. Someone in a privacy forum had posted a technical question about bandwidth requirements for real-time video over encrypted networks. The conversation that followed was academic in tone, but disturbing in content. They were discussing the feasibility of broadcasting live events to paying audiences without law enforcement being able to trace the source. Red rooms were mentioned only in passing, dismissed by most participants as urban legends that didn't match the technical realities of anonymous streaming. But one poster disagreed, claiming they'd encountered legitimate examples hidden deep within invitation-only networks. They refused to provide details, but something about their matter-of-fact tone suggested they weren't making it up. That comment stayed with me over the following nights. During my hourly rounds, walking between empty warehouses with only my torch for company, I found myself thinking about what might be happening in other buildings, in other cities, in other countries. Places where people gathered to watch things that should never be filmed, let alone broadcast to paying customers. The search took longer than I'd expected. Every obvious lead turned out to be a scam or a honeypot. The deeper I dug, the more sophisticated the gatekeeping became. This wasn't just about knowing the right websites. It was about establishing credibility within communities that valued secrecy above all else. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. I'd been helping moderate a forum for night shift workers. Nothing dramatic, just removing spam and settling the occasional disagreement. When I received a private message from someone I'd never interacted with before. They claimed to appreciate my contributions to the community and wondered if I'd be interested in discussing more sensitive topics in a private channel. The conversation that followed was careful, coded, full of references I didn't understand, and questions designed to test my knowledge and intentions. Gradually, it became clear that they were evaluating whether I could be trusted with access to something most people would never see. The invitation, when it finally came, was for a private network that existed several layers deeper than anything I'd encountered before. Access was limited to verified members only, with new users requiring sponsorship from existing participants. The verification process was extensive. Proof of identity, background checks, even references from other members who could vouch for your discretion. It took nearly 2 months to gain full access, and by then I wasn't entirely sure I wanted it anymore. But curiosity had become compulsion, and the same methodical approach that had served me well in local government carried me through the final stages of the approval process. The private network was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 100 active users at most, but the content was unlike anything I'd seen before. They called themselves documentarians, claiming to preserve authentic human experiences that would otherwise go unrecorded. But the experiences they were interested in documenting were things most people would never want to see. The Red Room section was hidden within a subsection marked Live Archives. 3 different providers, each claiming to offer unscripted real-time content featuring genuine participants. The language was clinical, designed to maintain plausible deniability while making the actual service clear to interested viewers. I spent weeks researching the providers before making contact with one. Their operation appeared professional. Encrypted communications, scheduled sessions, technical support for viewers having connection issues. They operated more like a legitimate streaming service than the criminal enterprise I'd expected. The booking process was surprisingly straightforward. Payment handled through an escrow system that provided guarantees for both parties. I was provided with connection details and technical requirements for a session scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 a.m. When the time came, I found myself sitting in the security office, surrounded by monitors showing empty car parks and darkened warehouses, about to witness something I knew would change how I saw the world. The session began promptly at the scheduled time, connecting me to a live stream that took several minutes to stabilize through the encrypted network. The video quality was poor but functional, showing what appeared to be a small, windowless room with concrete walls. A single chair sat in the center, currently empty, while cameras captured the space from multiple angles. A chat interface allowed communication with other viewers, though the messages were sparse and cryptic. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room occasionally flickering as the stream quality adjusted. I was beginning to wonder if this was some kind of performance art, when a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. The man who entered was unremarkable, middle-aged, wearing simple clothing, moving with the casual confidence of someone in familiar surroundings. He spent several minutes adjusting equipment I couldn't see clearly, occasionally glancing at the camera as if checking the feed quality. Then he left, and we were back to watching an empty room. The waiting was almost worse than what came next. Other viewers were using the chat to place bets, make requests, discuss payment options for specific outcomes. I realized I was witnessing something that existed at the intersection of entertainment and crime, where the audience was complicit in whatever was about to happen. When the door opened again, there were 2 figures. The same man as before, now accompanied by someone much younger. A woman, early 20s perhaps, who seemed confused about where she was or how she'd gotten there. She looked around the room with growing alarm, taking in the cameras and bare walls and single chair with obvious distress. The chat exploded with activity. Dozens of messages appearing faster than I could read them. Viewers making suggestions and placing bets on what would happen next. Bitcoin addresses were being shared. Payments arranged in real time. I watched in horrified fascination as what I was witnessing transformed from observation into participation. The man guided the woman to the chair with gentle but firm insistence. She kept looking directly at the cameras, as if trying to understand what they were recording. Her expression shifted from confusion to fear as the reality of her situation became clear. I should have closed the browser immediately, should have reported what I was seeing, though I had no idea how to explain where I'd found it or whether anyone would believe me. Instead, I found myself paralyzed, unable to look away from something I knew was fundamentally wrong. The man began responding to requests from the chat. He would pause, read something on a screen I couldn't see, then nod or make adjustments to whatever he was preparing. The audience was directing the performance, choosing what happened next through their messages and payments. Then something changed. The steady stream of chat messages stopped abruptly, replaced by a series of warnings from different users. Abort session, abort session, abort session. The man looked directly at the camera, his expression shifting from professional calm to genuine alarm. He moved quickly to something off-screen, and within seconds the video feed cut out entirely. I stared at a blank screen showing only a connection error message. When I tried to reload the page, the entire site was gone. The private network, the forums, even my access credentials, everything had vanished as if it had never existed. Over the following days, I tried to convince myself that what I'd witnessed had been elaborate fiction, a performance designed to extract money from people curious about the darker corners of human nature. The production quality could have been achieved with basic equipment, and everything I'd seen could have been staged by competent actors. But I kept thinking about those final moments before the stream ended, the way the man's demeanor had changed when he'd seen those warning messages, the speed with which everything had shut down. It felt less like a show ending and more like an emergency evacuation. 2 weeks later, I noticed the van. It was parked across from the industrial estate entrance when I arrived for my shift on Tuesday night. Nothing unusual about that. People parked there regularly to use the cash machine at the petrol station next door. But this van was still there when I did my first round at midnight, and again at 1 o'clock, and again at 2. Through the security office windows, I could see it clearly in the light from the street lamps. Dark blue, no markings, windows tinted too dark to see inside. Just sitting there, facing the estate entrance, as if whoever was inside was watching for something, or someone. The van was there for 3 consecutive nights before it disappeared. During that time, I noticed other things. Cars that seemed to follow the same route past the estate at regular intervals. A jogger who ran the same circuit at 3:30 every morning, always glancing towards the security office as they passed. Small anomalies that individually meant nothing but together suggested a pattern. On the Friday night, after the van had finally gone, I received an email at my personal account. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank. The message contained only a single line of text. "We know what you watched." Below that was an attachment, a photograph taken through the security office window, showing me sitting at the desk with my laptop open. The image was clear enough to make out details of the screen, though not clear enough to see exactly what I'd been viewing. I deleted the email immediately and ran every security scan I could think of, changed all my passwords, cleared my browsing history, even formatted the laptop's hard drive. but the damage was already done. Whoever had sent that message had been close enough to photograph me through the office window without triggering any of the motion sensors around the building. That was 6 months ago. I've changed jobs since then. Couldn't concentrate on the security work after that. Kept seeing suspicious vehicles that probably weren't there and hearing footsteps that were likely just the building settling. I work days now, in an office with other people around, where everything feels safer and more predictable. But I still get emails occasionally, never more than once a month, always from different anonymous addresses. Sometimes it's another photograph, my car in the supermarket car park, my flat building taken from across the street, me walking to work on Tuesday morning. Once, it was a copy of my employment records from the security company. Each one carries the same message. We know what you watched. I don't know what they want from me. Money, silence, complicity. None of it would surprise me at this point. But I've learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some audiences never stop watching, even after the show has ended. The thing that bothers me most isn't the surveillance or even the constant feeling of being monitored. It's knowing that somewhere out there, in windowless rooms with concrete walls and multiple cameras, things are still happening that should never be filmed. That people are still gathering online to watch and direct and pay for experiences that exist at the furthest edges of human cruelty. And now I'm part of it, whether I want to be or not. A witness who can't testify. A viewer who can't unsee. Connected forever to something I stumbled across during the long, quiet hours of a night shift in Coventry. Sometimes I wonder if that was always the plan. If the whole thing, the forums, the invitations, the careful vetting process, was designed not just to provide entertainment for paying customers, but to create a network of compromised witnesses, people who'd seen too much to ever feel completely safe again. People like me, who now understand that the worst monsters aren't hiding under beds or lurking in dark alleys. They're sitting in rooms just like the one I'm in now, watching screens that show things no human being should ever have to see. The package arrived on a Monday morning while I was having coffee in my kitchen, addressed to me by name, but with no return address or delivery company markings. Just a plain brown box sitting on my doorstep, like it had materialized overnight. Inside was a laptop I'd never seen before, expensive looking but completely unmarked, along with a handwritten note explaining that I'd been selected for a freelance research project that would pay £500 for a few days' work. I was 29 and struggling to keep my freelance writing career viable, mostly producing content for local businesses and the occasional magazine article when editors needed someone who could work quickly and cheaply. The money being offered was more than I usually earned in a month. The note was brief and professional, explaining that the research involved documenting online communities that weren't accessible through normal browsers. Nothing illegal, just academic investigation of how information spreads through hidden networks that most people never encounter. They'd chosen me based on my journalism background and writing samples they'd found online, looking for someone who could observe and document without technical preconceptions about what they might discover. The laptop came preloaded with software I'd never used before, along with detailed instructions for accessing what they called alternative information networks. The process was more complex than regular internet browsing, involving multiple steps and security protocols that suggested the content wasn't meant for casual access. I should have been more suspicious about receiving expensive equipment from anonymous sources, but the financial pressure of freelance work made the opportunity difficult to refuse. £500 would solve several immediate problems and buy me time to find more reliable income. The first communities I accessed were disappointingly mundane. Discussion groups about privacy rights, archives of academic papers, forums where people shared information that had been censored from mainstream platforms. Exactly the sort of content you'd expect researchers to study. But as I explored more widely, following links and recommendations between different communities, I began encountering material that was considerably more disturbing than academic research. Not obviously illegal content, but documentation of activities that mainstream platforms wouldn't host. Real-time discussions about events that weren't being reported in normal news sources. Communities sharing information about incidents they claimed were being deliberately suppressed. The research brief had asked me to focus particularly on communities discussing local events, incidents in Newcastle, and the surrounding areas that might not be receiving broader media attention. I found several groups dedicated to what they called regional intelligence. People sharing information about activities in their immediate geographic areas that weren't appearing in local newspapers or radio broadcasts. The Newcastle section was surprisingly active, with dozens of regular contributors discussing everything from local authority decisions to business activities that weren't being publicly reported. Some posts included photographic evidence supporting claims about incidents that had supposedly occurred, but weren't being covered by local media. Images of accident scenes, building damage, even what appeared to be emergency service activities that hadn't been mentioned in official reports. The documentation quality was often professional, suggesting either serious amateur investigators or people with official access to information that wasn't being shared publicly. One thread that particularly caught my attention focused on missing persons cases in the Northeast that hadn't received media coverage. Contributors shared details about people who had disappeared without official investigations being launched, or families being properly informed about search efforts. The cases they discussed weren't random disappearances, but seemed to follow patterns that suggested systematic targeting of specific types of individuals. People living alone, working irregular hours, without strong family connections that would ensure immediate reporting of their absence. I recognized some of the locations being discussed, areas of Newcastle where I'd worked on assignments, neighborhoods I was familiar with from my journalism research. The proximity made the content feel more immediate and credible than if it had been about distant places. As I documented these communities for my research assignment, I started cross-referencing their claims with official sources and mainstream news reports. What I discovered was disturbing. Many of the incidents they discussed had indeed occurred, but with minimal official acknowledgement and virtually no media coverage. Missing person reports that had been filed but not publicized, accident investigations that had been conducted but not reported, even criminal activities that had been recorded but not prosecuted. Either the hidden communities had access to official information that wasn't being shared publicly, or they were conducting their own investigations into incidents that authorities were choosing not to pursue. I started contributing to the discussions, sharing information I'd gathered through my journalism work that might be relevant to their research. Nothing confidential, just background context about local issues that could help verify or contradict claims being made. The response was immediate and encouraging. Other contributors provided additional information that helped me understand connections between different incidents, patterns that weren't obvious when each event was considered individually. They also began sharing more sensitive material with me, including documentation that suggested some of the missing persons cases were connected to activities that were being deliberately concealed from public scrutiny. Photographs of locations where people had last been seen, records of their final communications, even evidence that their disappearances had been noted by authorities but not investigated with appropriate thoroughness. The material painted a picture of systematic negligence or deliberate concealment, with certain types of disappearances being treated as administrative problems rather than potential crimes requiring investigation. I should have reported this information to appropriate authorities, rather than continuing to participate in communities that were clearly operating outside official oversight. But I was becoming genuinely concerned about the patterns they were documenting, and traditional journalism hadn't provided opportunities to investigate issues that weren't being acknowledged by official sources. About 6 weeks into my research, I received additional instructions that shifted the focus of my assignment. Rather than just documenting existing communities, I was asked to investigate specific cases that had been identified as potentially significant. People who had disappeared under circumstances that suggested they might be connected to activities that weren't being properly investigated. The cases were all local to Newcastle, involving individuals who shared characteristics that made their disappearances particularly concerning. All lived alone, all worked from home, or had irregular employment. All had minimal family connections that would ensure immediate reporting of problems. I was provided with detailed background information about each case, personal histories, work patterns, social connections, even financial circumstances that might make them vulnerable to exploitation. The level of detail was impressive, but also unsettling. Someone had conducted comprehensive research into these individuals' private lives, gathering information that wouldn't be available through normal journalism or official investigation. I started investigating the cases using traditional journalism methods, contacting police departments, searching public records, trying to verify the claims that these disappearances weren't being properly investigated. What I discovered confirmed the hidden community's allegations about systematic negligence. Most of the cases had indeed been reported to authorities, but with minimal follow-up investigation. Missing person reports had been filed, but searches had been perfunctory and investigations had been closed quickly without resolution. The pattern suggested either severe resource limitations affecting police response to certain types of cases, or deliberate decisions to avoid thorough investigation of disappearances that met specific criteria. I documented my findings and shared them with the hidden communities, hoping to contribute to their ongoing research into systematic problems with missing person investigations. But I also started to notice changes in my own circumstances that seemed connected to my investigation activities. People I'd contacted during my research began experiencing problems that interfered with their ability to provide information. Sources became reluctant to discuss cases they'd previously been willing to address openly. Some contacts mentioned receiving warnings about sharing information with journalists, though they couldn't identify who had contacted them or what authority they represented. My own internet connectivity became unreliable when accessing certain types of information, and I started experiencing technical problems with equipment that had previously functioned normally. Most unsettling was discovering that people were asking questions about my research activities in contexts that suggested my investigation was being monitored by individuals with access to information I hadn't shared publicly. I researched methods for conducting journalism investigations without creating unnecessary visibility for sources or subjects, but realized that my activities had already attracted attention from people who had resources to monitor and interfere with independent research. The hidden communities provided advice about protecting investigation activities from unwanted scrutiny, but also warned that certain types of research could create personal risks for investigators who weren't prepared for retaliation. Several contributors mentioned experiencing harassment after their documentation had led to official attention, including professional difficulties financial problems, and even personal safety concerns. They advised extreme caution when investigating cases that might be connected to activities involving people with official authority or significant resources. This advice proved relevant sooner than I'd expected. About 2 months after beginning my research, I received a visit that made it clear my investigation activities had attracted unwanted attention. 2 people arrived at my flat, claiming to represent a government agency investigating unauthorized access to sensitive information. They were polite but thorough, asking detailed questions about my research methods and the sources of information I'd been accessing. They seemed particularly interested in the hidden communities I'd been participating in, asking whether I'd identified other contributors or learned about similar research activities in different regions. Their knowledge of my investigation was comprehensive, suggesting either sophisticated monitoring of my online activities or information provided by sources within the communities I'd been researching. They explained that some of the cases I'd been investigating were connected to ongoing official operations that required confidentiality to maintain effectiveness. My journalism research was potentially compromising legitimate law enforcement activities by drawing unwanted attention to sensitive investigations. They didn't threaten me directly, but made it clear that continuing my research could create legal complications that would be difficult to resolve through normal journalism channels. In exchange for discontinuing my investigation, they were prepared to provide background information that would help me understand why certain missing person cases weren't being pursued through traditional methods. The explanation sounded plausible, but their approach made me uncomfortable. The level of surveillance they demonstrated suggested resources that went far beyond normal law enforcement oversight of journalism activities. I agreed to discontinue my research while privately resolving to verify their claims through independent sources. Over the next few weeks, I tried to confirm the legitimacy of the agency they claimed to represent and the official operations they described. I found no corroborating evidence for their explanation. No government agencies matching their description. No official operations that could account for the systematic negligence I documented. No legitimate reasons why missing person investigations would be deliberately restricted. Either their work was so classified that no public information existed, or the explanation had been fabricated to discourage my investigation. I returned to the hidden communities to share my concerns and seek advice about verifying official claims that couldn't be independently researched. The response was immediate and alarming. Several community members reported similar experiences: official contact after investigating sensitive cases, explanations that couldn't be verified, pressure to discontinue research that had identified problematic patterns. Some contributors had been threatened with prosecution for accessing classified information, though the classification of their research couldn't be verified through normal channels. Others had experienced escalating problems that made continuing their investigation impossible. Technical difficulties, financial pressures, even personal safety concerns that forced them to abandon their research. The pattern suggested coordinated efforts to discourage investigation of activities that were operating without proper oversight or accountability. I started researching the individuals who had visited me, trying to understand their actual authority and whether their claims about official operations could be substantiated. The business cards they'd provided led to addresses that didn't correspond to legitimate government offices, and the phone numbers connected to generic voicemail systems that provided no useful information. Either they were operating with extraordinary secrecy protocols, or they represented interests that weren't connected to legitimate law enforcement activities. I was beginning to understand that I'd stumbled across something considerably more complex than systematic negligence in missing person investigations. The patterns I documented were likely evidence of activities that were being conducted outside official oversight, with missing persons cases being deliberately ignored to avoid scrutiny of whatever was causing the disappearances. The hidden communities had become a way for people to document and share information about these activities, creating alternative investigation networks for cases that weren't being pursued through official channels. But participation had also made us visible to people who had resources to monitor our research and motivation to discourage our documentation. Last week, I discovered something that confirmed my worst suspicions about how closely my activities were being monitored. The laptop that had been provided for my research assignment contained sophisticated surveillance software that had been recording not just my investigation activities, but all my computer usage, internet communications, and even ambient audio from my flat. I'd been under comprehensive observation since the moment I'd accepted the research assignment, with everything I'd discovered, everyone I'd contacted, and every piece of evidence I'd gathered being monitored by people who had provided the tools for my investigation. The realization that my research had been watched from the beginning made me understand that the assignment itself had been part of a system designed to identify and monitor people who might investigate activities that weren't meant to be scrutinized. The £500 had been payment for allowing myself to be surveilled while investigating cases that were connected to activities someone wanted to keep hidden. I'd essentially been recruited to document my own investigation, providing comprehensive intelligence about my methods, sources, and findings to people who could use that information to prevent similar research by others. The package that had started everything sits in my desk drawer now, containing evidence of surveillance that extends far beyond my own investigation, to include systematic monitoring of anyone who asks inconvenient questions about missing persons cases in the Northeast. I still write freelance articles for local businesses, still struggle with the financial uncertainty of independent journalism, still wonder which of my sources might be experiencing problems because I contacted them during research that was being monitored from the beginning. But I'm also aware that my investigation activities are being recorded, my communications are being monitored, and my research methods are being studied by people who turn curiosity about systematic problems into comprehensive intelligence gathering about the people asking questions. The worst part about finding out your basement was used as a torture chamber isn't the bloodstains, it's realizing you helped pay for the soundproofing. 4 months ago, I was just a small-time landlord in Portsmouth, trying to make enough rental income to cover my mortgage payments. Now, I'm staying in a Premier Inn outside Winchester, and tomorrow the police are going to search the basement flat I've been renting out to what I thought was a quiet, professional tenant who's actually been broadcasting murders to dark web audiences while I collected rent money from upstairs. I inherited the house from my grandmother 2 years ago, a Victorian terrace that had been converted into 3 separate flats. The rental income from the upper 2 floors helps me pay the mortgage while I live in the main house. It's not a huge moneymaker, but it covers the bills and gives me some financial security in an uncertain economy. The basement flat has always been the most difficult to rent. It's below street level, doesn't get much natural light, and feels a bit cramped compared to the other units. Previous tenants usually moved out within 6 months, complaining about the atmosphere or finding somewhere brighter. I'd started to think it might remain empty long term. When Marcus Thompson contacted me about the basement flat, he seemed like the ideal tenant. Professional references, stable income from freelance consulting work, and he specifically requested a quiet, private space where he could work from home without disturbances. He was willing to pay 6 months' rent in advance and didn't mind the flat's limitations. Marcus explained that his work involved sensitive client consultations that required complete privacy and discretion. He needed soundproofing installed, which he offered to pay for himself, and requested that I minimize visits to the property unless there were genuine emergencies. This arrangement suited me perfectly, a reliable tenant who wanted to be left alone. The soundproofing work Marcus arranged was more extensive than I'd expected. Professional contractors installed industrial-grade acoustic materials throughout the basement flat, along with enhanced ventilation systems and what appeared to be specialized electrical work. Marcus assured me this was all necessary for his consulting business and that it would improve the property's value. After Marcus moved in, the basement flat became remarkably quiet. I rarely heard any activity from downstairs, which was exactly what he'd requested. He kept regular business hours, with occasional evening appointments, and maintained the property well. As far as tenancy arrangements go, it was ideal. Marcus also proved to be an excellent tenant in other ways. He always paid rent on time, never complained about minor issues, and generally required minimal management. He occasionally had visitors for what he described as client meetings, but they were always professional and discreet. The rental income was steady and reliable. About 2 months after Marcus moved in, he asked about making additional modifications to the basement flat. He wanted to install specialized lighting and upgrade the internet connection to support what he called high-bandwidth client communications. He offered to cover all costs and assured me the improvements would benefit future tenants. The internet upgrade was substantial: fiber optic cables, commercial-grade equipment, and backup systems that seemed excessive for normal home use. When I asked Marcus about the requirements, he explained that his consulting work involved real-time video communications with international clients who demanded professional quality connections. Marcus's business appeared to be thriving. He mentioned expanding his client base and taking on more complex projects that required enhanced technical capabilities. The basement flat was being equipped to professional standards that would allow him to offer premium services to demanding clients. Around this time, I started noticing unusual activity around the property. Delivery vans arriving at odd hours, often staying for extended periods, while Marcus supervised the unloading of equipment. When I asked about these deliveries, Marcus explained that his business required specialized equipment that needed careful handling and setup. The deliveries became more frequent and elaborate. Professional camera equipment, sophisticated lighting systems, and computer hardware that looked expensive and technical. Marcus assured me this was all legitimate business equipment necessary for his expanding consulting practice. I also noticed that Marcus had begun receiving visitors at unusual hours, late evening appointments that sometimes lasted until dawn, often involving multiple people who would arrive separately and leave at different times. Marcus explained that international clients required flexible scheduling due to time zone differences. The visitors were always discreet and professional, but something about their behavior seemed unusual. They would arrive with their own equipment, work intensively for several hours, then leave with everything they'd brought. Marcus described these as intensive consulting sessions that required complete focus and privacy. About 3 months ago, Marcus approached me about a different type of arrangement. He wanted to sublease the basement flat occasionally to other professionals who required similar facilities for their own consulting work. He offered to increase the rent substantially and assured me that all subletters would meet the same professional standards he maintained. The subletting arrangement seemed reasonable, particularly given the increased income it would provide. Marcus handled all the arrangements directly, screening potential subletters and managing their access to the property. I rarely saw these temporary tenants, but Marcus assured me they were all legitimate professionals. The subletting activity increased the overall usage of the basement flat, but it remained remarkably quiet thanks to the soundproofing Marcus had installed. Occasionally, I'd notice increased electricity usage or signs that multiple people had been using the space, but there were never any disturbances or complaints from neighbors. 2 weeks ago, everything changed when I received an unexpected visit from the police. They were investigating what they described as online criminal activity and had traced some suspicious internet traffic to my property. They asked detailed questions about my tenants and requested permission to examine the basement flat. The police examination revealed that Marcus's consulting business was actually a cover for something much darker. The basement flat had been converted into a sophisticated broadcasting studio designed for creating what they called dark web content. The soundproofing, lighting, and technical equipment weren't for legitimate consulting. They were for producing illegal streams. The investigators explained that the basement flat had been used to broadcast live violence to paying audiences on the dark web. The consulting sessions I'd observed were actually torture and murder sessions being streamed to thousands of viewers who paid to watch authentic suffering rather than staged entertainment. Marcus and his subletters hadn't been running a consulting business. They'd been operating a red room facility. The discreet professional visitors I'd seen were victims being brought to the basement for broadcasts. The extensive equipment deliveries had been setting up a professional murder studio in my own property. The police showed me evidence recovered from the basement flat, computer systems configured for dark web broadcasting, payment processing equipment for handling viewer subscriptions, and recording devices that had captured dozens of murder sessions over the months Marcus had been my tenant. Most disturbing was learning that I'd been unknowingly facilitating systematic murder for entertainment. My rental property had become a venue for dark web red rooms, and I'd been collecting rent money from people who were using my basement to broadcast torture and death to international audiences. The investigation revealed that Marcus's operation was part of a larger network that specialized in using rental properties as temporary red room venues. They would rent properties from unsuspecting landlords, convert them for broadcasting purposes, then relocate before attracting suspicion. The police explained that landlords like me were ideal targets because we provided legitimate cover for their activities while having minimal oversight of what tenants actually did in rented spaces. The rental arrangement created a buffer between their operations and law enforcement, making it difficult to trace their activities. My property had apparently been selected because the basement flat provided the privacy and isolation necessary for red room broadcasting, while the conversion to multiple flats meant that unusual activity would seem like normal rental property management. Marcus had been specifically looking for this type of setup. The legal implications of the situation are complex. While the police don't suspect me of knowing participation, my property was used for serious crimes, and I potentially face civil liability from victims' families. The rental income I received could be characterized as proceeds from criminal activity. More immediately, the property has been sealed as a crime scene while investigators gather evidence. I can't access my own home, can't collect rent from other tenants, and face substantial legal costs, even though I had no knowledge of Marcus's real activities. The investigation has also revealed the scope of Marcus's network. Similar operations have been discovered in rental properties across southern England, all using the same model of targeting small landlords who wouldn't closely monitor tenant activities. I'm apparently just one victim in a much larger scheme. I've been staying in hotels while the investigation continues, unable to return home and uncertain about my legal and financial future. The police have warned me that the case will take months to resolve and that I may need to testify about my unwitting involvement in facilitating the operation. The most horrifying realization is how easily I was manipulated into providing the perfect venue for systematic murder. Every reasonable request Marcus made, soundproofing, privacy, professional equipment, was actually preparation for broadcasting torture and death to paying dark web audiences. The rental income I thought was helping secure my financial future was actually payment for providing a murder venue. The quiet, professional tenant I appreciated was actually a killer who needed somewhere discreet to broadcast authentic suffering to international subscribers. Tomorrow, forensic teams will begin a detailed examination of the basement flat to gather evidence about the scope of Marcus's operation. They've warned me that the investigation will uncover disturbing details about what happened in my property while I lived upstairs, unaware of the horror taking place below. I keep thinking about all the victims who died in my basement while I went about my normal daily routine overhead. People were being tortured and murdered for entertainment, while I watched television, cooked dinner, and slept peacefully, never knowing what was happening one floor below. The police have explained that Marcus's network specifically targets properties where landlords live separately from tenants, creating the isolation necessary for red room operations, while maintaining the legitimacy of a normal rental arrangement. My Victorian terrace conversion was perfect for their purposes. I've been advised to contact a solicitor about potential civil liability and criminal implications, even though I had no knowledge of Marcus's activities. The legal system struggles with cases where property owners unknowingly facilitate dark web crimes through legitimate rental arrangements. The financial implications are also substantial. Beyond legal costs, I face potential civil claims from victims' families, possible seizure of rental income received from Marcus, and the costs of restoring the property after forensic examination. My rental business may be effectively finished. I'm writing this from a premier inn outside Winchester, where I'll remain until the investigation concludes and I'm allowed to return home. The police believe Marcus's network is still active and that my cooperation with the investigation may have made me a target for retaliation. The most terrifying thought is how many other landlords might be unknowingly hosting similar operations. How many rental properties across the country might house dark web red rooms? How many small landlords might be collecting rent from systematic killers without realizing what they're facilitating? The rental property market provides perfect cover for these operations. Legitimate business arrangements that create privacy and isolation while deflecting suspicion from criminal activities. Landlords like me become unwitting accomplices to horror we never suspected was happening. Marcus's network understood exactly how to exploit the rental system, targeting properties and landlords that would provide the cover they needed while minimizing the risk of discovery. The conversion to multiple flats, the basement location, my preference for hands-off property management, it all made my property ideal for their purposes. Tomorrow's forensic examination will reveal the full extent of what happened in my basement flat while I collected rent money from upstairs. But I already know that I'll never be able to think of property rental the same way again. The landlord becomes an unwitting venue provider for systematic murder, and there's no way to unknow what your property was really used for. And somewhere out there, Marcus's network is probably targeting other landlords, looking for the next basement flat to convert into a dark web broadcasting studio. I never thought being a landlord could make me complicit in murder, but apparently collecting rent from the wrong tenant can turn your property into a venue for horrors you never imagined. I thought I was helping a local artist with a photography exhibition, but it turns out the subjects weren't volunteers, and most of them had no idea they were being documented. I grew up in Brighton, surrounded by creative types from an early age. My mum was a ceramicist, half our neighbours were musicians or artists of some description, and there was always someone looking for help with exhibitions, installations, or other projects that needed extra hands. By the time I started studying at Sussex University, I'd spent years helping with gallery openings and art events around the city. That background made me a natural choice when people needed someone reliable to assist with creative projects. I knew how galleries worked, understood the local art scene, and could handle everything from hanging paintings to managing guest lists. It was good casual work that fitted around my history degree and often led to interesting conversations with artists whose work I genuinely admired. When Marcus approached me about helping with his latest photography project, it seemed like exactly the sort of opportunity I enjoyed. He was a conceptual artist who specialized in documentary photography, exploring themes around privacy, surveillance, and urban life in contemporary Britain. His previous exhibitions had received good reviews in the local arts press, and he had connections with several respected galleries. The project he needed help with was called Observed Lives and focused on how people behaved in private spaces when they believed they were unobserved. Marcus explained that he was interested in the contrast between public personas and private behaviors, documenting the authentic moments when people thought nobody was watching. He'd been developing the project for several months, working with volunteer subjects who had agreed to allow him to photograph them during ordinary daily activities. The volunteers came from various backgrounds and age groups, providing a cross-section of how different people experience privacy and solitude in urban environments. My role would be organizing the photographs and helping to prepare them for exhibition. Marcus had accumulated hundreds of images and needed someone to help catalog them, identify the strongest pieces, and work out how they should be presented in a gallery setting. It was exactly the sort of behind-the-scenes work I'd done for other artists, and Marcus offered to pay reasonably well for what seemed like straightforward archival assistance. The photographs themselves were genuinely striking. Marcus had a good eye for composition and timing, capturing moments of genuine spontaneity and emotion. People cooking alone in their kitchens, reading in bed, having phone conversations they thought were private. The images had an intimate quality that was both compelling and slightly uncomfortable to view. What impressed me most was how natural and unposed the subjects appeared. Unlike typical portrait photography where people were clearly aware of the camera, these images showed people behaving exactly as they would if they were completely alone. Marcus had obviously developed excellent rapport with his volunteers to achieve such authentic results. But as I worked through more of the collection, I began noticing technical details that seemed inconsistent with the collaborative process Marcus had described. Many of the photographs appeared to have been taken from significant distances, using telephoto lenses that would have required the photographer to be positioned well outside the subjects' homes. The angles suggested shots taken from across streets, through windows, or from elevated positions that wouldn't have been accessible if the subjects had been aware of the photography sessions. The lighting also seemed wrong for posed photography. Most images showed people in natural indoor lighting, without the additional illumination that would be necessary for good quality photography in domestic environments. The shots looked more like surveillance photographs than collaborative artistic documentation. When I asked Marcus about these technical aspects, he explained that achieving authentic results required photographing people in their genuine living environments without artificial lighting or obvious camera presence. The volunteers had agreed to extended documentation periods during which Marcus would capture their daily routines using discrete equipment and techniques. That explanation addressed my technical concerns, but raised new questions about the consent process and how the volunteers had been recruited for such an invasive project. Marcus showed me some of the paperwork associated with the project, including consent forms that volunteers had signed agreeing to be photographed during normal daily activities. The forms looked legitimate and included detailed explanations of what the project involved and how the resulting images would be used. But the consent forms raised as many questions as they answered. The volunteers' personal details were limited to first names and partial addresses, making it difficult to verify that these were real people who had genuinely agreed to participate. The signatures looked authentic, but there was no independent verification that the people signing the forms understood what they were agreeing to. More concerning was the scope of the project. According to the documentation, Marcus had been photographing some volunteers for weeks or months, documenting their daily routines in comprehensive detail. The level of surveillance involved seemed excessive even for an ambitious art project about privacy and observation. I started paying closer attention to the specific content of the photographs, looking for clues about how they had actually been produced. Many images showed people in states of partial undress or engaged in intimate activities that seemed unlikely to have been performed knowingly in front of a photographer. Subjects changing clothes, bathing, or in bed with partners in ways that suggested complete privacy rather than awareness of being documented. Other photographs captured people in moments of emotional vulnerability, crying, arguing, or dealing with personal problems in ways that would be difficult to fake, even with excellent acting skills. These images had the spontaneous quality of genuine private moments rather than performed scenarios. The most disturbing images showed people in situations that appeared dangerous or distressing. Subjects who looked ill, intoxicated, or upset in ways that suggested they might need help rather than documentation. Some photographs showed people in domestic environments that looked unsafe or neglected, raising questions about their welfare and living conditions. If these images were genuinely collaborative, Marcus would have been ethically obligated to intervene in situations where his volunteers appeared to be in distress or danger. The fact that he had continued photographing rather than offering assistance suggested that the subjects were unaware of his presence. I began to suspect that Observed Lives wasn't a collaborative project at all. Instead, Marcus had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of people in their homes, documenting their private lives without consent or knowledge. When I tried to research Marcus's previous work more thoroughly, I found inconsistencies in his artistic background that made me question whether he was a legitimate photographer at all. While he had indeed exhibited work in local galleries, the scope and technical quality of those exhibitions were much more limited than he'd suggested. His artistic reputation seemed to be based on a small number of shows that had received minimal critical attention, rather than the established career he'd implied. More troubling was the lack of documentation about how his previous projects had been developed. There were no interviews, reviews, or academic discussions that explained his methods or explored the ethical dimensions of his surveillance-based photography. Either Marcus was much less established in the art world than he'd claimed, or his previous work had also involved questionable methods that reputable critics and curators preferred not to examine too closely. I decided to investigate some of the locations where the observed lives photographs had been taken, hoping to understand more about how the project had been conducted. Several of the images showed distinctive architectural features or interior details that made it possible to identify specific buildings or neighborhoods. Using this information, I was able to locate some of the properties where Marcus claimed to have been working with volunteer subjects. What I found was deeply disturbing. Most of the buildings were ordinary residential properties with no obvious connection to artistic projects or experimental photography. The residents I spoke to had never heard of Marcus or any project involving documentary photography of private domestic life. More significantly, some of the properties had recently experienced break-ins or reports of prowlers that corresponded with the timeframes when Marcus claimed to have been conducting photography sessions. Residents described incidents of someone being seen in their gardens, evidence of attempted entry through windows, and feelings of being watched that they couldn't explain. Marcus hadn't been collaborating with volunteers at all. He'd been systematically stalking and surveilling people in their homes, using sophisticated photography equipment to document their private lives without consent. The art project was actually a cover story for what amounted to organized voyeurism and invasion of privacy on a massive scale. But understanding what Marcus was really doing didn't immediately resolve my situation. I'd been working with him for several weeks and had access to hundreds of photographs that constituted evidence of serious crimes. Simply walking away from the project might not protect me if law enforcement investigated his activities. More importantly, the people whose lives had been documented deserved to know what had happened and to have the opportunity to take legal action against their privacy violations. But contacting them would require admitting my involvement in cataloging and organizing the images of their private lives. I was trapped between my ethical obligation to help Marcus's victims and my potential legal liability for having assisted with organizing the evidence of his crimes. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to treat our working relationship as if everything was completely normal. He regularly checked on my progress with cataloging the photographs and discussed plans for the eventual exhibition. He seemed genuinely excited about the artistic and commercial potential of the project. His casual attitude toward what he'd been doing was almost as disturbing as the surveillance itself. Marcus clearly didn't see anything wrong with systematically violating people's privacy for artistic purposes. He viewed his subjects as source material rather than human beings whose consent and dignity mattered. When I tried to raise ethical concerns about the project, Marcus dismissed them as conventional thinking that failed to appreciate the innovative nature of contemporary conceptual art. He argued that all significant artistic breakthroughs required challenging social norms and conventional ideas about privacy and consent. He also pointed out that none of his subjects had been physically harmed, and that the photographs revealed nothing more intimate than what could be observed by neighbors, delivery drivers, or other people who had legitimate access to residential areas. That argument completely missed the point about consent and violated the fundamental principle that people should have control over how their private lives are documented and shared. But it also revealed something important about how Marcus justified his behavior to himself. He'd constructed an elaborate intellectual framework that allowed him to view systematic stalking and surveillance as legitimate artistic practice. I began to worry that Marcus's current project wasn't his first experience with this type of unauthorized documentation. Someone who was comfortable with such extensive privacy violations had probably been engaging in similar behavior for years, developing the technical skills and psychological justifications that made observed lives possible. I started researching unsolved cases of stalking voyeurism, and privacy violations in Brighton and surrounding areas, looking for incidents that might be connected to Marcus's activities. What I found was a pattern of reports spanning several years that seemed consistent with someone conducting systematic surveillance of residential properties. Prowler sightings, attempted break-ins, and reports of photography equipment being used to observe people in their homes. Most of these incidents had been reported to police but hadn't led to arrests or prosecutions. Stalking and voyeurism cases are notoriously difficult to solve unless perpetrators are caught in the act, and many victims are reluctant to pursue complaints that require them to discuss intimate details of their private lives. But the pattern suggested that Marcus had been conducting unauthorized surveillance projects for much longer than just the Observed Lives exhibition. He'd probably been stalking and photographing people for years, gradually developing more sophisticated methods and expanding the scope of his activities. The art project framework was just his latest approach to organizing and justifying behavior that had been going on for a long time. That realization made my situation much more serious. I wasn't just helping with a single problematic art project. I was potentially assisting someone who had been systematically stalking and harassing people for years. If Marcus was arrested and prosecuted for his activities, my involvement in organizing his photograph collection could be presented as evidence that I'd been aware of the criminal nature of his work and had chosen to assist him anyway. But I also knew that allowing him to continue meant that more people would be victimized by his surveillance activities. The Observed Lives project was clearly successful from his perspective, and he was probably already planning similar future projects that would involve stalking and photographing additional victims. I needed to find a way to expose what Marcus was doing while minimizing my own legal exposure and ensuring that his existing victims received appropriate support and information about what had happened to them. The challenge was that any effective intervention would require admitting my involvement in organizing the evidence of his crimes. I decided to document everything I could about Marcus's activities and methods, building a comprehensive record that could be provided to law enforcement if necessary. But I also started making copies of some of the most clearly non-consensual photographs, focusing on images that showed evidence of the surveillance techniques he'd used. These copies could potentially be used to help his victims identify what had happened and take appropriate legal action. Most importantly, I began identifying specific locations and timeframes where Marcus had conducted surveillance, hoping to provide enough information for people to determine whether they had been targeted by his photography projects. The process of documenting Marcus's crimes while pretending to continue helping with his exhibition was emotionally exhausting. Every day meant handling more evidence of serious privacy violations while maintaining the pretense that I considered his work legitimate artistic practice. But I was also motivated by anger about what he'd done to innocent people who had no idea their most private moments had been photographed and catalogued for an art exhibition. The subjects in his photographs weren't collaborators or volunteers. They were victims of systematic stalking who deserved justice and protection from future harassment. However, my careful documentation process was interrupted when Marcus announced that he'd found a gallery willing to exhibit the Observed Lives collection. The exhibition was scheduled to open in 6 weeks, meaning that hundreds of photographs documenting unauthorized surveillance would soon be publicly displayed in a respected Brighton gallery. Marcus's victims would potentially discover that their private lives had been violated only when they saw their own images hanging on gallery walls, viewed by strangers who had paid admission to observe their most intimate moments. I had to act immediately to prevent the exhibition from proceeding and to alert the victims about what had been done to them. I still can't quite believe how quickly things went from normal to absolutely terrifying. 2 months ago, I was just a minicab driver in Newcastle, trying to make ends meet after losing my warehouse job. Now I'm hiding in a service station near Durham, and tomorrow night I'm supposed to help transport someone to their death in a Red Room broadcast that I've been unknowingly facilitating for weeks. I've been driving for Galaxy cars for about 6 months. It's not glamorous work, late nights, drunk passengers, navigating through traffic for what works out to less than minimum wage most shifts. But after the warehouse closed down, it was the only job I could get that didn't require waiting weeks for security clearances or training courses. You just need a clean license, a reasonably decent car, and the ability to deal with difficult people. The job that changed everything started in early October. I got a call from the dispatcher about a regular booking, someone who needed transport twice a week, always the same route, always paid in cash. The customer was described as a professional gentleman who required discretion and reliability. The pay was better than usual, and regular bookings are gold dust in the minicab business. The passenger was a man in his 40s called Michael Stevens. He was always waiting outside when I arrived, always polite and professional, and never wanted to make small talk during the journey. The route was consistent: pick up from a residential address in Gosforth, drive to an industrial estate on the outskirts of the city, wait for about 2 hours, then drive him back home. Michael explained that he worked in media production and needed transport to a specialized facility where his company created content for online platforms. He said the work required unusual hours and that he preferred having a reliable driver rather than using different taxi services that might not understand his schedule. The industrial estate where I dropped Michael was one of those anonymous business parks filled with warehouses and small manufacturing units. The specific building he used was unmarked, with blackened windows and several high-end cars usually parked outside. During the 2-hour wait, I'd see other people arriving and leaving, all carrying equipment cases or technical gear. After several weeks of this routine, Michael started asking if I'd be interested in additional work. He needed someone to help with equipment transport, moving cameras, lighting gear, and computer systems between different locations. The pay was substantially better than driving, and Michael assured me the work was straightforward manual labor. I agreed to the additional work, partly for the money, and partly because I was curious about what kind of media production required such elaborate security and secrecy. Michael explained that his company created specialized content for niche audiences who paid premium rates for high-quality, authentic material. The equipment transport work involved loading and unloading professional-grade cameras, sophisticated lighting systems, and computer servers that seemed more advanced than anything I'd seen in normal television or film production. Everything was carefully packaged and required precise handling to avoid damage. Michael gradually introduced me to more aspects of his operation. He needed help setting up equipment in different locations, not just the industrial estate, but also residential properties and commercial spaces around Newcastle and the surrounding areas. The setups were always temporary, designed to be assembled quickly and dismantled without leaving traces. The locations varied, but they all shared certain characteristics: soundproofed rooms with controlled access, spaces that could be completely isolated from outside observation, and technical infrastructure that supported high-bandwidth internet connections. Michael explained that this variety was necessary for creating diverse content that would appeal to different audience preferences. As weeks passed, Michael began explaining more about his business model. His company produced what he called authentic interactive content for online platforms that specialized in realistic, unscripted material. Viewers paid substantial amounts for access to live streams that felt genuine rather than obviously staged or performed. The technical requirements for this content were demanding. Multiple camera angles, professional lighting that could be adjusted in real time, audio systems that captured every detail, and streaming infrastructure that could handle thousands of simultaneous viewers without interruption. Michael's operation was sophisticated enough to meet these standards consistently. Michael also started discussing the importance of finding suitable performers for his content. He explained that the most valuable material featured people who provided authentic reactions to various situations. Viewers could distinguish between obvious acting and genuine responses. So his company specialized in creating scenarios that produced real emotions and reactions. About a month into the equipment work, Michael asked if I'd be interested in a different type of assignment. He needed someone to help with what he called scenario testing, essentially helping to verify that technical setups would work correctly for live broadcasts. The pay for this work was even better, and Michael assured me it was just technical verification rather than actual content creation. The scenario testing involved me spending time in the prepared spaces, while Michael operated the equipment from control rooms. He would test camera angles, audio levels, lighting configurations, and streaming quality by having me move through different positions and respond to various prompts he provided through the technical systems. Michael explained that this testing was essential because his audience expected flawless technical quality. Any problems with audio, video, or streaming could ruin the viewing experience and damage his company's reputation. The testing sessions helped ensure that everything would work perfectly during actual broadcasts. The testing became increasingly elaborate. Michael would simulate various scenarios, test my responses to different types of stimuli, and document my reactions to unexpected situations. He said this comprehensive testing helped his company understand how their technical setups would perform under the stress of live broadcasting. During these sessions, Michael would give detailed instructions about timing, positioning, and responses to different cues, follow specific movement patterns, react to various sensory inputs, demonstrate how someone might behave in challenging circumstances. He claimed this testing helped optimize the technical systems for capturing authentic human responses. 3 weeks ago, everything became clear in the most horrifying way possible. I was conducting what Michael had described as a final comprehensive test when I noticed that the monitors in the control room were displaying more than just local recording interfaces. Multiple screens showed dark web streaming platforms with view accounts, indicating thousands of people watching live feeds. Michael's media production company wasn't creating content for mainstream online platforms. It was broadcasting live torture and murder to paying audiences on the dark web. The spaces I'd been helping to set up were red rooms, and I had been unknowingly preparing them for operation, while gradually being recruited as their transport coordinator. The weeks of scenario testing had been training sessions, teaching me the locations and procedures I'd need to know as their logistics coordinator. My equipment transport and setup work had been gradually transformed into preparation for facilitating actual red room operations, moving victims and managing the technical infrastructure. Michael dropped all pretense when he realized I understood what was happening. He calmly explained that minicab drivers were ideal logistics coordinators for his operation. They could transport victims without raising suspicion, had legitimate reasons for visiting multiple locations, and could move equipment between sites as part of their normal work routine. The industrial estate facility was just one node in a larger operation that used multiple locations across the Northeast. Michael's company specialized in identifying and recruiting people whose jobs provided cover for the gradual conditioning process required to create authentic dark web content, my scenario testing sessions had been training me for tomorrow night's operation. I'd been learning the procedures for transporting unwilling victims, understanding the technical requirements for live broadcasts, and becoming familiar with the security protocols necessary for avoiding detection during actual Red Room events. I managed to escape while Michael was distracted with technical preparations, but I know his surveillance network extends far beyond the locations I'd visited. They've been monitoring my communications, tracking my movements through the minicab company's GPS systems, and building detailed profiles of my personal life. Since leaving Newcastle, I've been moving between different locations, but they keep finding me. Messages sent to my phone despite changing numbers, people who seem to recognize me at petrol stations and service areas, evidence that my movements are being tracked through methods I don't understand. Yesterday, I received a package at the bed and breakfast where I'd been staying. A package containing a sat-nav device that showed tomorrow night's pickup location and delivery route. Michael's operation had been preparing for months, and they expected me to transport their next victim to the prepared Red Room facility. The package included detailed information about tomorrow's victim, a young woman who had been selected and prepared through their recruitment network. They knew her routines, her vulnerabilities, and exactly how to get her into my car without raising suspicion. My role was to collect her and deliver her to the broadcast location. I could go to the police, but Michael has spent months creating evidence that would suggest I was a willing participant in his dark web activities. Galaxy Cars would have records of my regular bookings, my involvement in equipment transport, and my participation in what they would call training sessions that could be presented as voluntary preparation for criminal activity. Security cameras at the various locations would show me helping to set up equipment, following Michael's instructions, and participating in what could be characterized as preparation for facilitating kidnapping and murder. Without context, my actions would appear to show someone knowingly working as a logistics coordinator for dark web Red Room operations. Michael's operation is too sophisticated, too well established, too experienced at managing unwilling participants. The minicab industry provides perfect cover. Drivers regularly visit unfamiliar locations, work irregular hours, and have legitimate reasons for transporting equipment and spending time in industrial areas. Tomorrow night, thousands of people will watch what Michael's audience has been anticipating for weeks. They've paid to see a carefully planned abduction and murder, and they expect their logistics coordinator to deliver the victim as promised. My months of unknowing preparation have led to this moment. I'm writing this from a service station toilet because it's one of the few places with constant lighting and regular security patrols. But I know they're still watching somehow. The sat-nav device included details about tomorrow's victim and pickup location, suggesting their operation extends to surveillance and recruitment networks I never suspected. In roughly 20 hours, I'll have to decide whether to collect the victim they've assigned me or refuse to participate and face the consequences. But Michael has demonstrated that his network can track me across multiple counties, and they have evidence that could destroy my life even if I don't complete tomorrow's assignment. The most terrifying realization is that Michael's operation probably uses multiple drivers simultaneously. How many other minicab drivers might be unknowingly transporting victims to Red Room facilities? How many regular bookings might be training operations for logistics coordinators who don't understand what they're really facilitating? The transport industry provides perfect access to isolated workers who visit unfamiliar locations, handle sensitive cargo, and are expected to maintain discretion about their passengers and destinations. It's an ideal setup for exploitation by people who understand how to gradually transform routine work into participation in something much darker. Michael's technical expertise allows him to maintain sophisticated surveillance and streaming operations while using legitimate transport needs as cover. His business credentials provide credibility, his security requirements deflect suspicion, and his resources allow him to maintain operations across multiple locations. Tomorrow's broadcast is being promoted as featuring a carefully orchestrated abduction using their trained logistics network. Michael's audience values the meticulous planning and professional execution that their driver coordination system enables. I never thought driving a minicab could lead to this kind of moral crisis. I thought the biggest risks were difficult passengers or road accidents. I never imagined that regular bookings could lead to becoming complicit in someone else's murder. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so terrifying. I spent months learning to become an accomplice to murder without knowing what I was training for. Tomorrow's broadcast is titled Perfect Delivery. Michael's audience is expecting a flawless abduction executed by their professionally trained logistics coordinator. And an innocent woman is going to die because I helped build the system that will kill her. The driver becomes the deliverer of death to someone who has no idea what's coming. And I still don't know if I'll show up or let them destroy my life for refusing to complete the delivery. Have you ever wondered what it's like to watch someone being murdered and not realize it until months later? 3 months ago, I was just a night security guard at a business park in Reading, spending my shifts reading books and doing crosswords. Now, I'm in protective custody somewhere in Wales, and my testimony about what I saw through CCTV cameras could expose a Red Room operation that's been broadcasting murders to thousands of viewers, while I unknowingly watched it all happen in real time. I've worked security for Morrison Security Services for about 2 years. It's easy work most of the time. Monitor CCTV feeds, do periodic building checks, log any incidents in the security report. The business park I cover has about 20 units, mostly small manufacturing companies and storage facilities that operate during normal business hours. My job is to make sure nothing gets broken into overnight. The unit that changed everything was Industrial Solutions Loyalty, a company that rented one of the larger warehouse spaces about 4 months ago. According to their lease application, they were in import-export, dealing with specialized equipment for various industries. They kept normal business hours initially, with delivery trucks arriving during the day and staff leaving by early evening. Industrial Solutions was run by a man called David Chen, who seemed professional and legitimate when he signed the lease. He explained that his company required enhanced security and privacy due to the sensitive nature of their work with international clients. This meant upgrading the CCTV coverage in their section of the business park and installing additional monitoring equipment. The upgraded surveillance system was impressive. High-definition cameras with night vision capabilities, audio recording equipment, and monitoring software that could track movement patterns and identify unusual activity. David explained that his clients required this level of security documentation for insurance and compliance purposes. As the security guard responsible for monitoring these feeds, I was trained to use the new equipment and given specific instructions about documenting any activity around Industrial Solutions. This included logging delivery times, recording visitor details, and maintaining detailed reports about anyone who accessed their facility outside normal business hours. Initially, everything seemed routine. Delivery trucks during the day, occasional evening meetings with what appeared to be international clients, and standard warehouse activities. The enhanced CCTV coverage meant I could monitor their operations more thoroughly than other units, but nothing seemed suspicious or concerning. About 6 weeks after Industrial Solutions moved in, their activity patterns began to change. Instead of finishing by early evening, staff would often remain until very late at night. The types of deliveries also shifted: fewer commercial trucks and more unmarked vans arriving at unusual hours, often staying for extended periods. David explained these changes when I mentioned them in my security reports. He said the company was expanding into time-sensitive international markets that required round-the-clock operations. The unusual delivery schedule was necessary to coordinate with clients in different time zones who needed immediate access to specialized equipment. The nighttime activities gradually became more frequent and elaborate. I'd watch through the CCTV feeds as people moved equipment around the warehouse, set up what appeared to be temporary work areas, and conducted meetings that sometimes lasted until dawn. The enhanced surveillance system captured everything in remarkable detail. Around this time, David asked me to expand my monitoring responsibilities. Beyond standard security surveillance, he needed detailed documentation of all activities around their facility for what he called operational compliance purposes. This meant reviewing recorded footage, creating timestamped logs of events, and maintaining archives of particularly important activities. The compliance documentation work paid substantially better than standard security duties, and David assured me it was just administrative record-keeping required by his international clients. I welcomed the additional income and found the work straightforward enough, essentially creating detailed reports about what I was already observing through the CCTV system. As weeks passed, the activities I was documenting became increasingly unusual. The warehouse would be reconfigured regularly, with temporary structures assembled and dismantled between sessions. Professional lighting equipment would be set up around specific areas, along with what appeared to be sophisticated recording devices. When I asked David about these activities, he explained that Industrial Solutions had expanded into creating training materials and documentation for their international clients. The temporary setups were necessary for filming instructional videos about equipment operation and safety procedures. The training sessions always followed similar patterns: extensive preparation involving equipment setup and lighting configuration, followed by what appeared to be filming activities, then thorough cleanup and equipment removal. My role was to document the timing and participants involved in these sessions for compliance purposes. The people involved in these training sessions seemed to change regularly, with new participants arriving for each filming event. David explained that this was because they were creating materials for different types of equipment and needed specialists with relevant expertise for each training video. What struck me as odd was how the participants behaved during these sessions. Unlike normal training or instructional filming, the people involved seemed distressed or reluctant. When I mentioned this in my reports, David assured me that realistic safety training required participants to demonstrate genuine concern about potential hazards. About 2 months ago, I started noticing technical equipment around the Industrial Solutions facility that seemed more sophisticated than necessary for creating training videos. Multiple camera angles, professional audio systems, and computer equipment that appeared designed for live broadcasting rather than simple recording. David explained that their clients required real-time access to training materials, necessitating live streaming capabilities. The enhanced technical setup allowed them to broadcast training sessions to international audiences who couldn't attend in person. This explained the sophisticated equipment and the emphasis on precise timing for their filming sessions. My documentation responsibilities expanded to include monitoring the technical aspects of these broadcasts. verifying that streaming equipment was functioning correctly, logging connection quality issues, and maintaining records of broadcast durations and viewer access logs that David's system automatically generated. The viewer logs were remarkable in their scope. Thousands of people from around the world were accessing these training broadcasts, with detailed analytics showing viewing patterns, geographic distribution, and engagement metrics. David's operation was clearly successful in reaching international audiences. 1 month ago, everything changed when I discovered what these broadcasts actually were. While reviewing archived footage for compliance documentation, I noticed that one of the computer monitors visible in the CCTV feed was displaying a dark web interface rather than the normal streaming platform David had described. The interface showed the same warehouse space I'd been monitoring, but it was labeled as a red room with viewer count displays and what appeared to be payment processing systems. The training sessions I'd been documenting weren't educational content. They were live torture and murder broadcasts being streamed to paying audiences on the dark web. The participants I'd watched weren't willing trainers demonstrating safety procedures. They were victims being murdered while thousands of people paid to watch. My detailed compliance documentation had been creating evidence of systematic killing for entertainment, and I'd been unknowingly facilitating the operation by providing security oversight. I realized that Industrial Solutions had never been an import-export company. The entire operation was designed to create a legitimate front for dark web red room broadcasting, using my security monitoring to ensure their activities remained undetected, while documenting everything for their own operational purposes. David's emphasis on enhanced security wasn't about protecting valuable equipment. It was about maintaining operational security for systematic murder. The professional CCTV coverage I'd been trained to monitor was partly for his own security, but also to create detailed archives of their broadcasts for premium subscribers. My compliance documentation hadn't been administrative record keeping. It had been creating detailed logs of murder events, participant information, and broadcast analytics that helped David's operation optimize their content for dark web audiences. I'd been an unwitting administrator for a systematic killing operation. When I confronted David about what I'd discovered, he calmly explained that I was already too deeply involved to simply walk away. Months of detailed documentation had created evidence trails that would suggest I was a willing participant, rather than an unknowing observer. My security reports contained information that could only have been gathered through knowing cooperation. David also revealed that my own activities had been under surveillance during this entire period. Security cameras monitoring the security office meant that my reactions to various broadcasts had been documented, showing my gradual normalization of increasingly disturbing content. This footage could be edited to suggest willing participation, rather than unknowing observation. I managed to escape and contact the police, but the investigation has revealed the complexity of prosecuting dark web crimes. The broadcasts were accessed through encrypted networks that make traditional evidence gathering extremely difficult. Most of the direct evidence exists in digital formats that require specialized technical knowledge to authenticate. More problematically, my own involvement creates complications for the prosecution. Months of detailed documentation and security monitoring could be characterized by defense lawyers as evidence of willing participation. My gradual acceptance of increasingly unusual activities could be presented as knowing cooperation rather than professional obligation. The police have moved me to protective custody while they investigate, but they've explained that dark web red room cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute successfully. The technology provides multiple layers of anonymity for operators and viewers, while the evidence often relies on witnesses whose own involvement can be questioned. David's operation has apparently shut down and relocated since my escape, but the police believe it's part of a larger network that operates multiple facilities across the country. Industrial Solutions was just one node in a system that uses legitimate business fronts to hide systematic murder broadcasting. The most disturbing aspect is learning how many people were involved in David's network without understanding what they were facilitating. Delivery drivers, equipment suppliers, cleaning services, and utility workers, all unknowingly supporting an operation that broadcast murder to international audiences. My case has become a test for how effectively law enforcement can prosecute dark web crimes using traditional legal frameworks. The police are trying to build a case that doesn't rely too heavily on my testimony, given the complications created by my unwitting involvement in documenting the operation. I've spent weeks in debriefing sessions, helping investigators understand how David's operation functioned and identifying other potential facilities that might be using similar business models. The scale of the network they've uncovered is far larger than anyone initially suspected. The investigation has revealed that Industrial Solutions was generating substantial revenue through their dark web broadcasts, with thousands of subscribers paying premium rates for access to live murder content. The professional quality and systematic operation made their broadcast particularly valuable to audiences seeking authentic material. I keep thinking about all the victims I watched die through those CCTV feeds, not understanding what I was really observing. People who were murdered while I documented their final moments for compliance reports that helped optimize their killer's broadcasting operation. The police have assured me that my cooperation is essential for prosecuting David's network, but they've also explained that the legal process could take years and that successful convictions are far from guaranteed. Dark web crimes exist in legal grey areas that traditional prosecution methods struggle to address effectively. I'm writing this from a safe house somewhere in Wales, where I'll remain until the investigation concludes and the trial process begins. The police believe David's network is still active and that my testimony poses a significant threat to their continued operations. Tomorrow, I'm supposed to meet with prosecutors who will determine whether my evidence is sufficient to build a case against David's network. But they've warned me that the legal challenges are substantial and that my own involvement creates complications that defense lawyers will certainly exploit. The most terrifying realization is that David's operation was just one of many similar networks operating across the country. The business park model provides perfect cover for dark web red rooms, using legitimate commercial spaces to hide systematic murder broadcasting, while unknowing security guards document everything. How many other security guards might be unknowingly monitoring murder broadcasts? How many business parks might house similar operations? How many people might be facilitating systematic killing without understanding what they're really observing? The dark web has made it possible for these operations to exist anywhere, hidden behind legitimate business fronts, broadcasting authentic murder to paying audiences while ordinary people unknowingly facilitate their activities. The technology makes it easy to hide, to pay anonymously, to consume murder as entertainment. I never thought security work could lead to becoming a witness to systematic murder. I thought the biggest risks were dealing with break-ins or equipment failures. I never imagined that monitoring CCTV feeds could make me complicit in facilitating dark web red room operations. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so horrifying. I spent months watching people die while thinking I was just doing my job, creating detailed documentation that helped optimize their murders for entertainment value. Tomorrow's meeting will determine whether my testimony can help prosecute David's network or whether the legal complications make a successful case impossible. Either way, I know I'll never be able to work security again. The guard becomes the witness to systematic murder, and there's no way to unsee what I've documented. And somewhere out there, David's network is probably setting up new operations, recruiting new security guards who don't know they're about to become unwitting administrators for the next generation of dark web entertainment.